a family torn apart by greed, a woman mocked for choosing what no one else wanted, and a discovery beneath old stone that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about wealth and worth. Watch until the end. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from and what you would do in her place. The house had stood on the same hillside for nearly 90 years, its stone walls darkened by weather and age, its windows reflecting light in ways that made it appear alive even when no one was inside. It was the kind of property that accumulated stories the way old would accumulated polish, layered and deepened by every hand that had touched it. 3 generations of the Hargrove family had lived within those walls, and for most of that time, the house had represented something greater than shelter. It was identity. It was proof that the family had endured when others had not. Eleanor Hargrove had known the house her entire life. She had walked its hallways as a child, memorized the sound each floorboard made under her weight, and learned to navigate its uneven staircases in the dark. She knew which windows stuck in summer and which doors swelled shut after rain. The house had been the backdrop to every meaningful memory she possessed, and yet, standing in front of it now, she felt none of the warmth those memories should have carried. The warmth had been drained slowly over the past 18 months, replaced by something harder and colder, something that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with the people who once shared it. Her father, Richard Hargrove, had died on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. The weather had been unremarkable, the kind of overcast stillness that settled over the region without announcing itself. He had been ill for some time, though he had resisted acknowledging it with the same stubborn precision he applied to everything else in his life. Richard had been a man of systems. He kept records of rainfall on the property going back 40 years. He maintained the stone walls himself, mixing mortar by hand long after his doctor warned him against lifting heavy materials. He filed every receipt, labeled every tool, and stored every document in the oak cabinet beside his desk with a discipline that bordered on ritual. What he had not done, with the same meticulous care he gave to everything else, was leave behind a will that could not be contested. The document existed. It had been drafted, signed, and witnessed, but its language, careful as it was, had left enough room for interpretation to become a weapon. Richard had divided his estate among his 3 children, Eleanor, her older brother Martin, and her younger sister Catherine, with provisions that reflected his understanding of each of them. Martin, the eldest, received the house and the majority of the surrounding land. Catherine, the youngest, was given the financial accounts, investment holdings, and a parcel of commercial property near town that generated steady rental income. Eleanor received what the will described as the lower structure and its contents, a phrase that referred to the cellar beneath the house, along with a modest cash bequest that would cover little more than a year of careful living. The division had not been equal, and no one pretended otherwise. Martin had accepted his portion with the quiet confidence of someone who had always expected to inherit the family seat. He was the firstborn, the one who had stayed closest to the property, the one whose name appeared beside their father's on local registers and community boards. His claim felt natural to those who observed the family from the outside, and Martin did nothing to discourage that perception. He carried himself with the bearing of a man who believed inheritance was not merely legal but moral, that the house belonged to him not because of a document, but because of proximity and commitment. Catherine's reaction was more complex. She had distanced herself from the family years earlier, building a life in the city that required neither the house nor the land to sustain it. Her share of the estate, the financial holdings, and the rental property suited her practical nature. She had always measured value in liquidity, in the ability to convert assets into opportunity. The will gave her exactly that, and she accepted it without sentimentality, but not without calculation. Catherine understood that money was influence, and influence was the truest form of inheritance. Eleanor's portion drew immediate and undisguised contempt. The cellar. She had been given the cellar. It was not a grand space. Beneath the house, accessed through a narrow staircase off the kitchen, the cellar extended roughly the length of the main structure. Its walls were old stone, its ceiling low enough to require a slight stoop in places. The floor was uneven, a combination of flagstone and packed earth that had never been properly finished. For decades, the cellar had served as storage, a place where seasonal equipment was kept, where preserves were shelved, where anything too large or too old for the house above was placed and gradually forgotten. Richard had used the cellar more than anyone else. He had spent hours down there, particularly in his later years, working on projects he rarely discussed. Eleanor remembered the sound of his footsteps descending the stairs, the faint scrape of tools against stone, the long silences that followed. When she had asked what he was doing, he had offered vague answers about organization, about sorting through old materials, about making sure things were in order. She had not pressed him. Her father was a private man, and privacy was one of the few requests he ever made. Now, standing in the kitchen of the house that was no longer hers, Eleanor understood the weight of what she had been given and, more painfully, what she had not. The cash bequest would sustain her for a year, perhaps slightly longer if she managed it carefully. She had no other significant savings. Her work as a restoration consultant for historical properties was steady but modest, dependent on contracts that came and went with the seasons. She had no partner, no second income, no financial cushion beyond what her father had left her. The cellar, whatever it contained, was not a lifeline. It was a gesture, one whose meaning she could not yet decipher. Martin made his position clear within days of the reading of the will. He intended to renovate the house, to modernize its interior while preserving the exterior that gave it value. The cellar, he explained, would eventually need to be integrated into his plans. He suggested, with a tone that carried neither malice nor sympathy, that Eleanor should remove whatever she wished to keep and do so promptly. The implication was that her access to the property had an expiration date, one he would determine. Catherine offered no resistance and no support. She had already begun the process of liquidating her inherited assets, converting them into forms she could manage remotely. When Eleanor called to discuss the situation, Catherine listened politely and then redirected the conversation to logistics. How soon could Eleanor clear her things? Had she spoken to a lawyer about the will's language? Was she planning to contest the division? The questions were practical, efficient, and entirely without warmth. Eleanor did not contest the will. She had considered it, spent sleepless nights turning the possibility over in her mind, but ultimately decided against it. Legal battles required money she did not have and energy she could not afford to waste. More importantly, she believed her father had made his choices deliberately. Richard Hargrove did not act carelessly, even in death. If he had given her the cellar, there was a reason. She did not yet know what it was, but she trusted the man who had taught her to read the grain of old wood and the settle of ancient stone. The mockery was not always direct, but it was persistent. At the family gathering that followed the funeral, relatives spoke in low voices that carried further than they intended. Eleanor heard fragments, words like unfortunate and stubborn, and Cellar repeated with inflections that ranged from pity to amusement. Martin's wife, a woman whose opinions arrived fully formed and rarely revised, remarked within earshot that Eleanor had always been the sentimental one, the one who valued feeling over practicality. The comment was not cruel in isolation, but in context, surrounded by people dividing a dead man's legacy, it landed with precision. Neighbors were less restrained. The Hargrove estate was well known in the area, and the details of its division traveled quickly through the community. At the hardware store, at the post office, in the parking lot of the grocery store, people offered Eleanor the kind of sympathy that contained its own judgment. How unfortunate that she had been left so little. How strange that her father had chosen to separate the cellar from the house. Had there been a falling out? Had she done something to deserve less? The questions were rarely asked directly, but their presence hung in every interaction, shaping the way people looked at her and the way she began to look at herself. She moved through those early weeks with a discipline that surprised even her. She secured temporary housing in a small rental unit on the outskirts of town, a clean but sparse apartment that felt temporary by design. She continued her work, accepting contracts that kept her busy and her mind occupied. She did not speak about the inheritance except when asked, and when asked, she answered briefly and without complaint. The restraint cost her more than anyone knew. At night, alone in the unfamiliar silence of the apartment, she replayed conversations, imagined different outcomes, and fought the corrosive thought that her father had valued her less than her siblings. The financial reality pressed closer with each passing week. Her restoration work, which had always been enough to sustain a modest life, now carried the full weight of her existence without the safety net she had unconsciously relied upon. A contract she had expected to be renewed was awarded to a younger firm whose bid undercut hers by a margin she could not match. A property owner who had promised 6 months of steady work postponed the project indefinitely, citing budget concerns that sounded rehearsed. Eleanor understood that her professional reputation had not changed, but the context around it had shifted. She was no longer a consultant with family resources behind her. She was a woman working alone, and the market sensed vulnerability the way water sensed a crack in stone. Her apartment, chosen for its affordability rather than its comfort, revealed its limitations gradually. The heating system cycled unpredictably, leaving certain hours of the night cold enough to require an extra blanket she had taken from the house before Martin changed the locks. The kitchen faucet developed a slow drip that the landlord promised to fix and then forgot. The walls were thin enough to carry conversations from the unit next door, fragments of someone else's life intruding into her solitude without invitation. She adapted to each inconvenience with a practical resilience she had inherited from her father, but the accumulation wore on her in ways that discipline alone could not address. One evening, returning from a site inspection that had taken longer than planned, she stopped at the gas station near her apartment and realized that the transaction would leave her checking account below the threshold she had set for herself as a minimum. The number on the screen was not alarming in isolation, but it represented a trajectory that could not be sustained indefinitely. She had calculated that her father's cash bequest would carry her through 12 months of careful management. 6 of those months had already passed. The remaining 6 stretched ahead like a road that narrowed with every mile. She thought about calling Catherine, not for money, but for advice. Catherine understood finance in ways that Eleanor did not, and there had been a time, years ago, when the sisters had been close enough to share problems without calculation. That time had ended gradually, eroded by distance and divergence, until the relationship became something maintained through obligation rather than affection. Eleanor set down her phone without dialing. The help she needed was not the kind Catherine could provide, and the vulnerability required to ask for it was a currency she could not afford to spend. The most painful encounter came unexpectedly, at a community event she had attended out of professional obligation rather than personal desire. A local historical society had organized a benefit for the preservation of a 19th century mill on the outskirts of town. Eleanor had contributed her expertise to the project in previous years and felt compelled to attend despite her circumstances. She dressed carefully, choosing clothing that suggested stability rather than strain, and arrived with the composed expression she had perfected over the preceding months. The event was well attended, the room filled with faces she recognized and voices she had learned to navigate. For the first hour, she managed the social terrain without incident, deflecting questions about the estate with practiced brevity and redirecting conversations toward the mill and its history. Then Martin arrived. He entered with his wife on his arm, and an ease that filled the space around him like expensive cologne. He greeted people by name, shook hands with the confidence of a man whose position in the community had been recently reinforced by inheritance, and moved through the room as if it had been arranged for his benefit. Their eyes met across a cluster of conversation, and Martin offered the same brief nod he had given her since the reading of the will. His wife, standing beside him, did not nod at all. She turned instead to a woman Eleanor recognized as the wife of the local bank manager and said something that produced laughter for both of them. The laughter was not directed at Eleanor, not visibly, but its timing and its direction carried a message that required no words. Eleanor set down her glass, excused herself from the conversation she had been maintaining, and left the event through a side door that opened onto the parking lot. She sat in her car for 10 minutes before starting the engine, her hands steady, her breathing controlled, her eyes dry. The tears would come later in the apartment, where no one could assign meaning to them. For now, she held herself together with the same mortar that held the stones of the house she had lost, invisible and necessary and stronger than anyone who looked at it from the outside would ever suspect. It was during one of those restless nights that she made the decision to go back. Not to the house, to the cellar. She contacted Martin and arranged a time. He agreed without enthusiasm, reminding her that the renovation timeline was accelerating and that her window for access was narrowing. She thanked him politely, ended the call, and began preparing with the same methodical care she applied to her professional work. She gathered tools she used on restoration sites, flashlights with extended battery life, a digital camera, measuring tape, notebooks, and the kind of patience that came from years of working with structures that revealed their secrets slowly. The morning she returned to the property, the air carried the crispness of early spring, still cool enough to see her breath, but warm enough to promise change. Martin's car was not in the driveway. He had given her the key to the side entrance and told her to lock up when she was finished. The house greeted her with familiar sounds, the click of the lock, the slight resistance of the door, the settling groan of old timber adjusting to the shift in air pressure. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, absorbing the space, then turned toward the narrow staircase that led downward. The stairs descended steeply, each step worn smooth by decades of use. The walls on either side were bare stone, cool to the touch, faintly damp in the way that underground spaces always were. A single bulb hung at the bottom, casting a yellowish light that barely reached the corners of the room. She switched on her flashlight and let the beam move slowly across the space. The cellar was larger than she remembered. Childhood memory had compressed it, made it feel cramped and cluttered. In reality, it extended the full length of the house, its ceiling supported by thick wooden beams that showed their age in the grain and color of the wood. The floor was a patchwork of flagstone and packed earth, uneven but solid. Along the walls, shelves held the accumulated debris of decades, glass jars clouded with age, metal tools whose purposes had been forgotten, boxes of documents yellowed and curling at the edges. She began at the far end, working systematically, cataloging what she found. The process was familiar. She had done this in dozens of old buildings, assessing condition, identifying materials, noting anything that seemed out of place or historically significant. The cellar rewarded her patience slowly. Behind a stack of wooden crates, she found a section of wall where the stone had been repointed more recently than the rest, the mortar lighter in color, applied with a different technique. Near the ceiling, a beam bore marks that did not match the others, cuts made with precision that suggested modification rather than original construction. She photographed everything, labeling each image with location and observation. The work was quiet and absorbing, the kind that allowed her mind to settle into a focused state where details emerged with clarity. Hours passed without her noticing. The light from a single bulb remained constant, unchanging, creating an atmosphere that existed outside of time. It was near the center of the cellar that she noticed the first significant anomaly. The floor in this section was entirely flagstone, each piece fitted tightly against its neighbors. The stones were old, their surfaces worn smooth, their edges softened by age. Yet beneath the layer of dust and grit that covered them, one section appeared slightly different. The stones here were the same material, the same approximate age, but their arrangement was more deliberate. The joints between them were narrower, more uniform, as if they had been laid by someone who valued precision above all else. She knelt, brushing the surface clean with her hand. The dust came away easily, revealing a subtle but unmistakable pattern. The flagstones in this section formed a rectangle, roughly 3 meters by 2, set within a larger floor like a panel within a frame. The edges of this rectangle aligned with faint grooves in the surrounding stone, grooves that could have been natural or could have been cut deliberately. Eleanor sat back on her heels, studying the pattern. Her training told her to observe before acting, to let the structure reveal its own logic before imposing hers. She ran her fingers along the grooves, feeling their depth and consistency. They were too uniform to be accidental, too straight, too deliberately aligned with the edges of the rectangular section. She retrieved her measuring tape and confirmed what her eyes had suggested. The rectangle was precisely proportioned, its dimensions exact to within millimeters. This was not the work of a farmer or a casual builder. This was the work of someone who understood construction at a fundamental level, someone who had taken extraordinary care to create something that appeared ordinary while concealing something that was not. The realization settled over her gradually, not as a sudden flash of insight, but as a slow accumulation of certainty. Her father had spent years in this cellar. He had worked down here alone, for hours at a time, on projects he never explained. The repointed wall, the modified beam, the precisely laid flagstones. Each detail was a sentence in a language she was only beginning to read. She stood, brushing the dust from her knees, and looked at the rectangular section with new understanding. The floor was not simply a floor. It was a surface designed to look permanent while concealing the possibility of access. Somewhere within this arrangement, there was a mechanism, a seam, a point where pressure or leverage would reveal what lay beneath. Her heart beat with a steadiness that surprised her. She had expected excitement, the rush of adrenaline that accompanied unexpected discovery. Instead, she felt something quieter and more profound, a sense of alignment, as if every decision that had led her to this moment had been part of a sequence she was only now recognizing. The years of restoration work, the training and reading, old structures, the patience her father had cultivated in her through 1,000 small lessons about stone and wood and time. All of it converged here, on this cold floor, in this dim light, in a cellar the rest of the world had dismissed as worthless. She pressed her palms flat against the flagstone and felt its temperature, constant and cool, unchanged by the seasons above. The stone had no opinion about the drama unfolding in the family that owned it. It simply endured, holding whatever lay beneath it with the same indifference it had maintained for decades. Eleanor found comfort in that indifference. Stone did not judge. Stone did not whisper behind your back or offer sympathy that tasted like pity. Stone simply was, and what it concealed completely until someone with the right knowledge and the right intention came to look. She walked the perimeter of the rectangular section, examining it from every angle. At the far edge, where the panel met the cellar's eastern wall, she noticed a slight discoloration in the stone, a darker shade that could have been moisture staining or could have been the result of repeated contact. She knelt again, running her fingers along the joint. The stone here was fractionally smoother than elsewhere, polished not by water, but by use, by years of something pressing against it in the same place, in the same way. She imagined her father's hands in this exact position, his fingers finding the same smoothness, his body folding into the same posture she now held. The thought connected her to him across the silence of his death, a thread of shared gesture that no one could sever and no sibling could claim. She sat back again and looked at the ceiling above the panel. The beam she had noticed earlier, the one with cuts that suggest a modification, was directly overhead. She studied it now with sharper attention. The cuts formed a channel, narrow and precisely routed, running the length of the beam and disappearing into the wall at either end. It was not structural. It served no load-bearing purpose. It was, she realized, a conduit, a path for something that had been threaded through the beam and into the surrounding architecture. Air, perhaps, or wiring for a system she had not yet identified. Another layer in a construction that revealed itself only to those who knew how to look. The cellar was speaking to her now in the language her father had taught her to hear. Every surface, every joint, every seemingly insignificant variation in material or technique was a word in a sentence that had been written decades ago and preserved in silence ever since. She needed only to read it completely, and the cellar would give up what it held. She did not attempt to open it. Not yet. The discipline her father had instilled in her, the same discipline that had made him spend years working quietly and methodically in this space, demanded that she understand the structure fully before disturbing it. She needed to know what she was dealing with, not just the what but the why. Instead, she turned her attention to the documents stored along the walls. If her father had built something into the floor of this cellar, he had likely left a record of it somewhere. Richard Hargrove documented everything. It was the defining habit of his life. Somewhere in the boxes and folders that lined the shelves, there would be a key, not a physical one, but an intellectual one, a set of instructions or observations that would explain what he had done and how to access it. She began pulling boxes from the shelves, opening them carefully, sorting their contents into categories. Most held what she expected: old financial records, property tax receipts, correspondence with local authorities about maintenance and zoning. Some contained personal items, photographs from decades past, letters written in her mother's handwriting, school reports bearing her own name and those of her siblings. She set these aside, noting them but not allowing sentiment to slow her progress. As the afternoon wore on and the light above ground shifted toward evening, she found what she was looking for buried in a box labeled structural notes in her father's precise handwriting. Inside were folders containing detailed drawings of the cellar, not architectural blueprints in the formal sense, but careful hand-drawn diagrams that mapped every wall, beam, and floor section with measurements and annotations. The drawings confirmed what she had suspected. The rectangular section of flagstone was marked differently from the rest, outlined in a heavier line, annotated with symbols she did not immediately recognize. Beside it, in small, controlled handwriting, her father had written a series of numbers and a single phrase that made her breath catch in her chest. Lower level. Original foundation. Do not disturb without full understanding. The phrase was not a warning against curiosity. It was a warning against carelessness. Her father had known that eventually someone would find this. He had prepared for it with the same meticulous care he applied to everything else. The numbers, she realized, were not codes or combinations. They were measurements, depths, and distances that described what existed beneath the flagstone panel, a second floor, a lower chamber, built into the original foundation of the house and sealed with deliberate precision. Eleanor closed the folder and held it against her chest for a moment, feeling the weight of paper and ink and decades of silent work. Her father had given her the cellar not as a consolation prize, not as a lesser share of a divided estate, but as the only part of the property that mattered. He had chosen her because he trusted her to understand, to be patient, to approach the discovery with the same discipline he had used to preserve it. The mockery, the pity, the sidelong glances and whispered judgments, all of it receded in that moment, replaced by a clarity that felt as solid as the stone beneath her feet. She did not yet know what the lower level contained. She did not yet understand the full scope of what her father had spent years protecting. But she knew, with a certainty that required no evidence beyond the drawings in her hands and the memory of a man who never acted without purpose, that the cellar held something extraordinary. She replaced the boxes on the shelves, returned the folder to its position, and climbed the stairs slowly. The house above was quiet, the light outside fading. She locked the side entrance behind her and stood for a moment in the cooling air, looking at the building that had once been her home and was now her brother's project. The cellar beneath it belonged to her. And within the cellar, beneath a floor laid with impossible precision, something waited. Something her father had spent years ensuring would be found only by someone who deserved to find it. Eleanor drove back to her apartment in silence, the folder's contents memorized, its implications expanding with every mile. She did not call Martin. She did not call Catherine. She did not call anyone. Some discoveries demanded solitude before they demanded explanation, and this was a discovery that had been waiting for decades to be understood. That night, she spread her own notes across the small table in her kitchen, combining them with the observations from the cellar. She sketched the rectangular section from memory, marking the grooves, the joints, the subtle differences in stone alignment. She listed the measurements from her father's drawings, cross-referencing them with the dimensions she had recorded herself. The numbers aligned perfectly. Whatever existed beneath that floor had been planned with a precision that left no room for accident. She thought about her father's hands, the way they moved when he worked, deliberate and unhurried, guided by an understanding of materials that went deeper than technique. She thought about the years he had spent in that cellar, the hours of quiet labor that no one had questioned because no one had thought to ask. She thought about the will, the carefully chosen language, the decision to separate the cellar from the house and place it in the hands of the one child who would know what to do with it. And she thought about what Martin and Catherine would say when they learned what their father had truly left behind. The thought did not bring satisfaction. Not yet. Satisfaction was premature. What it brought was resolve, a quiet, unshakable determination to finish what her father had started, to uncover what he had protected, and to honor the trust he had placed in her by doing it properly. She set her alarm for early morning, turned off the light, and lay in the darkness with the weight of the cellar pressing gently against her thoughts. The stone floor above a hidden chamber. The precise measurements. The careful handwriting of a man who had known, perhaps for years, that this moment would come. Sleep arrived slowly, carried by the steady rhythm of questions she was only beginning to ask. But beneath the questions, beneath the uncertainty and the anticipation, one thing remained constant. Her father had given her the cellar. And the cellar, she was beginning to understand, had been given everything. The days that followed required a patience Eleanor had not expected to need. The discovery of her father's drawings had ignited an urgency that pressed against every waking hour, urging her to return immediately, to open the floor, to see what lay beneath. Yet the same instinct that had kept her from acting rashly in the cellar kept her from acting rashly now. Preparation was not optional. It was the difference between understanding and destruction, between preserving what her father had built and ruining it through haste. She began by researching the history of the property with a thoroughness that surpassed anything she had done professionally. The Hargrove house had been built in the early 1930s, commissioned by her grandfather, Edward Hargrove, a man whose reputation in the region had been defined by two qualities, discretion and foresight. Edward had made his fortune through a combination of land investment and strategic partnerships with industrial firms during a period when the region was expanding rapidly. He had been, by all accounts, a man who understood the value of what was hidden as deeply as what was visible. The original construction plans for the house, which Eleanor located through the county records office, confirmed what her father's drawings had suggested. The foundation included a lower chamber, not unusual for houses of that era, where root cellars and storage vaults were common. What was unusual was the chamber's construction. The walls were reinforced with materials that exceeded any practical need for storage. The floor of the chamber was poured concrete of a thickness more commonly associated with commercial or industrial construction. The access point, according to the original plans, was through the cellar floor, precisely where Eleanor had found the rectangular panel of flagstone. The plans also revealed something the current structure did not immediately suggest. The lower chamber was larger than the cellar above it. It extended beyond the footprint of the house itself, reaching beneath the adjacent ground in a direction that aligned with the hillside. This was not a simple storage space. It was a vault, designed with intention and built with resources that suggested its contents were expected to justify the expense. Eleanor studied the plans for hours, committing every measurement and notation to memory. She cross-referenced them with her father's drawings, noting where his annotations supplemented the original design. Richard had not merely discovered the lower chamber. He had maintained it. His notes describe repairs made over decades, structural reinforcements applied to aging materials, moisture control measures implemented with the same meticulous care he gave to the fields above. He had been the chamber's custodian, its silent guardian, working alone in the cellar while the rest of the family lived their lives above, unaware of what existed beneath their feet. The question of why her father had never revealed the chamber's existence pressed against Eleanor with increasing weight. Richard had been a man of systems, of records, of transparency in all things visible. Yet this, the most significant feature of the property he had spent his life maintaining, he had kept entirely to himself. The secrecy was deliberate, sustained over years, and protected even in death by a will that placed the cellar in the hands of the one person he trusted to handle the discovery correctly. Eleanor considered the possibilities. Her father might have feared that knowledge of the chamber would attract attention the family could not control. He might have believed that its contents, whatever they were, required a kind of stewardship that could not be shared without risk. Or he might simply have understood, with the quiet wisdom of a man who had watched his children grow into distinct and sometimes conflicting individuals, that some truths could only be entrusted to the person least likely to exploit them. She thought of Martin, whose relationship with the property had always been possessive rather than reverent. Martin saw the house as a legacy to be claimed, a symbol of status to be maintained and displayed. He would have seen the chamber as an asset to be leveraged, its contents converted into capital as quickly as possible. She thought of Catherine, whose instinct for liquidity would have treated any discovery as a transaction, something to be appraised, sold, and deposited without sentiment or reflection. Eleanor understood then, with a clarity that carried no pride, only responsibility, why her father had chosen her. She was the one who would take the time to understand before she acted. She was the one who would see the chamber not as a windfall, but as a trust, a continuation of something her grandfather had begun and her father had preserved. The cellar was not a lesser inheritance. It was the only inheritance that mattered. Armed with this understanding, she prepared for her return. She assembled equipment suited to the task, tools for carefully lifting stone without damaging surrounding structures, lights powerful enough to illuminate a space that had been sealed for years, protective gear for working in an environment where air quality and structural stability could not be guaranteed. She also prepared documentation materials, determined that every step of the process would be recorded with the same precision her father had modeled throughout his life. The community's judgment continued to press against her during this period of preparation, sometimes in ways she anticipated and sometimes in ways that caught her off guard. At a local cafe, where she had stopped for coffee and a quiet hour with her research notes, a woman she recognized from her father's funeral approached with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The woman asked how Eleanor was managing, her voice carrying the particular softness reserved for people believed to be struggling. When Eleanor responded that she was doing well, the woman's expression shifted, a flicker of disbelief quickly concealed behind politeness. She mentioned that Martin's renovation plans were exciting, that the house would be magnificent once modernized, and that it was good to see the property in capable hands. The phrasing was careful, but its architecture was transparent. Capable hands meant Martin's hands. The implication was that Eleanor's hands held nothing of consequence. At the hardware store, a clerk she had known for years asked what project she was working on. When she mentioned needing specific tools for delicate extraction work, he assumed she was preparing for a professional contract. She did not correct him. The conversation drifted, as conversations in small towns often did, toward the Hargrove estate. The clerk mentioned hearing that Eleanor had received only the cellar, and his expression carried the same mixture of sympathy and bewilderment she had encountered everywhere. A cellar, he repeated, as if saying the word aloud might reveal a meaning he had missed. Eleanor nodded, paid for her purchases, and left without explanation. She had learned that defending her inheritance only invited further scrutiny, and scrutiny was something she could not afford. Martin himself provided the sharpest reminder of her position. During a phone call ostensibly about scheduling, he mentioned casually that he had received an estimate for the cellar's integration into his renovation. The contractor, he explained, had assessed the space as structurally sound but aesthetically limited. The plan was to convert it into a wine storage area, climate-controlled and professionally finished. Martin spoke about the project with enthusiasm, describing materials and layouts as if the cellar were already his to transform. When Eleanor reminded him that the cellar belonged to her, a brief silence followed, the kind that suggested not embarrassment but recalculation. He recovered quickly, acknowledging the legal distinction while implying that practical considerations would eventually require cooperation. The word cooperation, in Martin's vocabulary, meant compliance on his terms. Catherine weighed in from a distance, calling Eleanor one evening with a proposal that revealed more about Catherine's nature than it solved about Eleanor's situation. She suggested that Eleanor sell her claim to the Cellar back to Martin, using the modest proceeds to supplement her cash bequest and establish a more stable financial position. The suggestion was delivered with the efficiency of a business recommendation, stripped of any acknowledgement that the Cellar might hold value beyond its square footage. When Eleanor declined, Catherine's response was measured but final. She cautioned Eleanor against sentimentality, reminded her that attachment to physical spaces was a luxury only the financially secure could afford, and wished her well with a tone that suggested the conversation would not be repeated. Eleanor absorbed each of these encounters without visible reaction, storing them alongside the growing body of knowledge she was assembling about the property. Every dismissal, every expression of pity, every assumption that her inheritance was worthless reinforced a quiet determination that had nothing to do with proving others wrong and everything to do with honoring the trust her father had placed in her. The mockery did not make her angry. It made her certain. If the Cellar had been truly worthless, her father would not have spent decades maintaining what lay beneath it in secrecy. She contacted Martin again, requesting access. His response was curt but permissive. He mentioned that contractors would begin preliminary work on the house within the month and suggested that Eleanor complete her removal of personal items before then. The word removal carried an edge that Eleanor chose not to engage with. She confirmed the date and time, thanked him, and ended the call. The night before her return, she sat alone in her apartment, the original construction plans spread before her alongside her father's drawings and her own notes. The 3 layers of documentation, spanning nearly a century, told a story that no single generation could have written alone. Her grandfather had built the chamber. Her father had maintained it. And now, the task of opening it had fallen to her. She traced the outline of the rectangular panel with her finger, feeling the ghost of the grooves she had discovered in the flagstone. Somewhere beneath that floor, in a space designed to endure beyond the lives of those who created it, something waited. Something that had been protected with extraordinary care. Something that 3 generations of Hargrove discipline had conspired to preserve. She allowed herself, for the first time, to consider what might be there. Her grandfather had been a man of considerable means during a period when the world was uncertain and institutions were fragile. Banks had failed within living memory. Wars had consumed fortunes and dismantled empires. Men like Edward Hargrove, men who had built their wealth through careful judgment rather than reckless speculation, understood that the safest vault was one that no one knew existed. They had learned from history that visible wealth attracted visible threats, and that the truest security lay not in the strength of a lock, but in the absence of a door anyone thought to try. Her father had inherited that understanding, not as philosophy, but as practice. Richard had watched his own father maintain the chamber with quiet diligence, and he had continued the work without hesitation. The knowledge had passed between them like a trade, transmitted through observation and shared labor rather than formal instruction. Eleanor imagined them together, father and son, descending those narrow stairs into the cool silence of the cellar, working side by side in a space that existed outside the awareness of everyone above them. The thought carried a tenderness that surprised her. She had spent so many weeks absorbing the sting of perceived rejection that she had nearly missed the extraordinary gesture embedded in her inheritance. Her father had not diminished her. He had elevated her. He had looked at his 3 children, assessed their natures with the same precision he applied to stone and mortar, and placed the most important thing he possessed in the hands of the one he trusted most completely. The tears came then, quiet and unresisted, falling onto the paper spread before her like rain on documents that had waited decades for exactly this moment of recognition. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the silence of the apartment settle around her. Tomorrow, she would descend the stairs again. Tomorrow, she would kneel on the cold flagstone and begin the careful work of revealing what lay beneath. Tomorrow, the cellar would begin to give up its secrets. And when it did, The family that had dismissed her share of the inheritance as worthless would discover that the woman they had pitied was standing on a fortune none of them had imagined. But that revelation would come in its own time. Eleanor understood, as her father had understood before her, that patience was not the absence of action. It was action refined to its most deliberate form. The cellar had waited nearly a century. It could wait one more night, and when morning came, she would descend those stairs not as the sibling who had received the least, but as the daughter who had been entrusted with the most. The stone floor would open. The hidden chamber would breathe again after years of sealed silence, and the careful work of 3 generations would finally reveal its purpose. She folded the plans, stacked her notes, and placed them in the bag she had prepared for tomorrow. Everything was ready. Everything had been ready, she now realized, for longer than she had known. Her father had spent a lifetime making sure of it. All that remained was for her to walk through the door he had left open, the one that led not upward into the house her brother now claimed, but downward into the space that held the family's truest wealth. The apartment settled into darkness around her, but the weight in her chest had changed. It was no longer the heaviness of rejection or doubt. It was anticipation, solid and certain, grounded in the knowledge that some inheritances cannot be measured by their appearance, and some cellars are worth more than the houses built above them. Eleanor arrived at the property before the sun had fully cleared the ridge behind the house. The air was still, carrying the faint dampness of a night that had not yet released its hold on the ground. She parked at the side entrance and sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the house emerge from shadow as light crept down the stone walls. The building looked unchanged, indifferent to what was about to happen beneath it. She gathered her equipment from the back seat, each item selected with purpose and packed in the order she would need it. The bag was heavier than usual, weighted not just by tools, but by the knowledge of what they were meant to uncover. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door opened with the same soft resistance she remembered, and the house greeted her with its familiar sounds, the settling of timber, the faint whisper of air moving through spaces that had been closed overnight. She moved through the kitchen without pausing, her attention already drawn downward, toward the narrow staircase and the cellar beneath. The stairs received her footsteps with the same worn patience they had offered for decades. Each step carried her deeper into the cool, still air that lived beneath the house. The single bulb at the bottom cast its yellowish light across the space, and she supplemented it immediately with her own lights, positioning them to illuminate the center of the floor where the rectangular panel of flagstone waited exactly as she had left it. She set down her bag and stood for a moment, letting the silence of the cellar settle around her. The space felt different today, not physically. Nothing had changed in the arrangement of shelves or the position of stored objects. But the quality of the silence had shifted, becoming denser, more expectant, as if the room itself understood that the long period of concealment was approaching its end. Eleanor knelt beside the rectangular section and began her examination with the same deliberate care she had applied on her first visit. She brushed the surface clean, revealing again the precise joints and the narrow grooves that framed the panel. Her father's drawings lay beside her, open to the page that showed the chamber's access point. The annotations described a mechanism embedded within the stone itself, a counterweight system that would allow the panel to pivot downward once a specific sequence of pressure points was engaged. The design was elegant in its simplicity, relying on physics rather than hardware, on the natural weight of the stone itself rather than hinges or locks that could corrode or fail over time. She studied the diagram carefully, identifying the pressure point her father had marked. There were 3, positioned at intervals along one edge of the panel, each corresponding to a stone that was fractionally thinner than its neighbors. The difference was invisible to the eye, but detectable by touch, a deliberate imperfection built into a surface designed to appear uniform. She located the first point, pressing her fingers against the stone and feeling the slight give that confirmed its position. The second was a hand's width away, set deeper into the groove. The third lay at the far corner, where the panel met the surrounding floor. The sequence mattered. Her father's notes specified the order: first, third, second, with each press held for a count of 3 before moving to the next. Eleanor followed the instructions with a precision that felt almost ceremonial, her fingers pressing against stone that had not been touched with this intention in years. She counted silently, her breath steady, her focus absolute. Nothing happened. She released the pressure and sat back, reviewing the diagram again. The mechanism relied on counterweights concealed within the stone structure, weights that would shift when the pressure points were engaged in the correct order, gradually transferring the balance of the panel until gravity did the rest. If the system had not been activated in years, the counterweights might have settled into a resting position that required more force to overcome. She tried again, pressing harder this time, holding each point longer. On the third press, she felt it. A faint vibration beneath her fingers, barely perceptible, like the distant tremor of something, heavy beginning to move deep within the stone. She held her position, maintaining pressure on the third point, and waited. The vibration grew, accompanied by a sound she had never heard before, a low, grinding resonance that came not from the surface, but from within the floor itself. The rectangular panel shifted, not dramatically, not with the sudden collapse of a trapdoor, but with the slow, controlled descent of a surface engineered to move on its own terms. One edge dipped downward, creating a gap that widened by centimeters, revealing darkness beneath. Eleanor withdrew her hands and watched as the panel continued its measured descent. The counterweight system, dormant but not degraded, performed exactly as designed. The flagstones tilted along an axis concealed within the floor, their combined weight carrying them downward in a smooth arc that exposed the opening beneath. Dust stirred at the edges, rising in thin plumes that caught the light from her flashlights. The air that emerged from below was cool and dry, carrying a scent she recognized from years of working with sealed historical spaces, the mineral stillness of stone that had been isolated from the atmosphere for a very long time. The opening was roughly 2 meters by 1.5, its edges clean and precisely cut. Below it, a set of steps descended into the darkness, their surfaces covered in a fine layer of dust that showed no footprints, no marks of any kind. No one had been down these stairs in years, perhaps decades. Eleanor leaned forward, directing her flashlight into the opening. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the steps, and then, beyond them, a floor of poured concrete, smooth and uncracked, stretching beyond the reach of the light. She sat motionless at the edge of the opening for several minutes, absorbing what she was seeing. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The steps were stone, each one cut from the same material as the cellar floor, fitted with a precision that eliminated any visible joint or seam. The walls of the stairwell were lined with the same reinforced concrete described in her grandfather's original construction plans. Everything about the descent conveyed permanence, the conviction that whatever lay below was meant to endure not for years, but for generations. Eleanor checked her equipment one final time. Flashlights were fully charged. Her camera was ready. She carried a small air quality monitor, a precaution she always used when entering sealed spaces, and she clipped it to her jacket where she could read it easily. The device registered normal levels, confirming that the chamber below, despite its years of isolation, maintained breathable conditions. Her father's notes had mentioned a passive ventilation system built into the foundation, narrow channels that allowed air exchange without compromising the seal. Even in this detail, the builders had planned for the long term. She lowered herself onto the first step, testing its stability before committing her weight. The stone held firm, solid, and unyielding. She descended slowly, one step at a time, her flashlight moving ahead of her in careful sweeps. The stairwell was narrow, just wide enough for a single person carrying a moderate load. The walls pressed close on either side, their surfaces smooth and featureless. The temperature dropped with each step, settling into a constant coolness that spoke of deep insulation and stable conditions. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped. The chamber opened before her, larger than she had imagined even after studying the plans. The concrete floor extended in all directions, disappearing into shadows that her flashlight could not immediately penetrate. The ceiling was lower than the cellar above, perhaps 2 meters at its highest point, supported by columns of reinforced concrete spaced at regular intervals. The air was still, perfectly still, undisturbed by the drafts and micro-movements that characterized even the most sheltered above-ground spaces. This was air that had been contained, preserved, held in place by walls designed to resist not just intrusion, but time itself. She moved the flashlight slowly, letting the beam travel across the room. Shapes emerged from the darkness, resolving gradually into forms that defied her initial expectations. She had imagined boxes, perhaps, or shelving of the kind found in the cellar above. She had prepared herself for documents, for family records, for the accumulated artifacts of a family that valued preservation above all else. The scale of what she was seeing required a recalibration of those expectations. The chamber was not a closet or a crawl space. It was a room, a proper room, with dimensions that suggested it had been designed to accommodate not just storage but access, movement, and sustained work. The columns that supported the ceiling were spaced widely enough to allow clear sight lines from one end to the other, and the concrete floor was finished to a smoothness that would have been unnecessary for a space meant only to hold objects. This was a room someone had intended to use, to spend time in, to return to again and again over the course of a lifetime. Eleanor walked the perimeter first, as she always did when entering an unfamiliar structure. The walls were solid, their surfaces unbroken except for the narrow ventilation channels her father's notes had described. She ran her flashlight along the base of each wall, checking for moisture, for cracks, for any sign that the chamber's integrity had been compromised. There was none. The construction was immaculate, preserved by the same conditions it had been designed to create. The air held a consistent coolness, dry and mineral-scented, the atmosphere of a space that had achieved equilibrium with itself and maintained it without human intervention for years. She noticed details that her initial scan had missed. Along one wall, small hooks had been set into the concrete at regular intervals, designed to hold tools or equipment. Several still held items, a flashlight of an older design, a small brush with bristles flattened by use, a hand lens in a leather case. These were not the tools of construction. They were the tools of examination, of care, of someone who came to this space not to build, but to tend. She lifted the hand lens and held it to her eye, feeling the weight of it, the warmth of a handle that had been shaped by her father's grip over years of quiet use. The glass was clean, maintained even here, even in a space no one else knew existed. Near the center of the chamber, set into the floor, she found a small metal plate engraved with letters and numbers she recognized as her grandfather's initials and a date. 1934. The year the house was completed, the year this chamber had been sealed for the first time. She crouched beside it, tracing the engraving with her fingertip. Edward Hargrove had stood here nearly a century ago and placed this marker in the concrete before it set. He had known then that what he was building would outlast him. He had known that someone, someday, would stand where she now stood and read his name in the floor. The thought connected her to a man she had never met through a gesture that spanned generations, a quiet declaration of intent pressed into wet concrete by hands that understood the difference between building something and building something that lasts. She straightened slowly, her flashlight sweeping ahead toward the far wall where the shapes she had noticed from the stairwell resolved into their true forms. What she found was something altogether different. Along the far wall, arranged with the same meticulous order that characterized every aspect of the Hargrove approach to storage, stood a series of metal cabinets. They were not ordinary filing cabinets or storage units. These were climate-controlled containers, their surfaces marked with manufacturer's labels that Eleanor recognized from her work in historical preservation. The labels identified them as archival-grade units, designed to maintain specific temperature and humidity conditions independent of external environment. Each cabinet was sealed, its surface free of dust, its condition suggesting not neglect but active protection sustained over extraordinary periods of time. She approached the nearest cabinet slowly, her flashlight tracing its dimensions. The unit stood approximately 1.5 meters tall, its exterior a matte gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. A small dial on the front panel indicated internal conditions, and though the numbers had long since frozen in place, they told a story of careful calibration. Someone had set these units to specific parameters and ensured they remained within acceptable ranges for as long as possible. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the cabinet's latch. The mechanism responded smoothly, maintained by the same invisible hand that had maintained every other aspect of this chamber. The door swung open on silent hinges, and the interior light, powered by a battery system she could not immediately locate, flickered once and then held steady. The contents took her breath away. Shelves lined the interior of the cabinet, each one holding objects arranged with surgical precision. On the uppermost shelf, a row of small leather cases lay side by side, each one embossed with markings she did not immediately recognize. She lifted the nearest case and opened it carefully. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet that had maintained its color despite the passage of years, lay a collection of coins. Not ordinary coins. These were large, heavy, their surfaces gleaming with a warmth that only one metal possessed: gold. Each coin bore intricate engravings, designs that spoke of age and rarity, of mints that had operated centuries ago in countries that no longer existed under the same names. She replaced the case and opened the next. More coins, different in size and design, but equally ancient, equally pristine. The third case contained not coins, but small bars, each one stamped with markings that identified weight, purity, and origin. The gold caught her flashlight and returned it with a richness that seemed to generate its own illumination, as if the metal itself had stored the light of the years it had spent in darkness. Eleanor moved to the next shelf. Here, the objects were different, but no less extraordinary. Flat leather portfolios contained what appeared to be documents, but not the kind she had expected. These were certificates elaborately printed on heavy paper, bearing seals and signatures that she recognized as belonging to financial institutions, some of which still existed, others that had been absorbed through mergers and acquisitions over the decades. Bearer bonds. The terms printed on their surfaces describe values that made her vision swim when she attempted to calculate their sum. Each certificate represented a claim on wealth that had been generating returns for decades, compounding silently in the darkness of a chamber no one knew existed. She opened cabinet after cabinet, each one revealing another layer of the fortune her grandfather had assembled and her father had protected. One contained gemstones, diamonds and sapphires and emeralds housed in individual cases, each accompanied by documentation that described their characteristics with the technical precision of professional appraisal. The stones caught her light and fractured it into spectrums that danced across the concrete walls, brief flashes of color in a space that had known only darkness. Another cabinet held artwork, small paintings and drawings removed from their frames and stored flat between sheets of acid-free paper. Eleanor's professional eye recognized the quality immediately. Brushwork that belonged to masters, compositions that appeared in the reference books she consulted regularly in her restoration work. She did not touch them, understanding instinctively that their value demanded handling by specialists in controlled conditions. But she photographed each one through the protective layers, her camera recording what her mind was still struggling to fully comprehend. The final row of cabinets, positioned against the wall closest to the stairwell, contained what she would later describe as the collection's documentation. Ledgers written in her grandfather's hand cataloged every item in the chamber, describing its acquisition, its provenance, its estimated value at the time of purchase, and, in many cases, projections of future worth based on historical trends and market analysis. Edward Hargrove had not merely accumulated wealth. He had studied it, understood it, and preserved it with the deliberate intention of creating a reserve that would outlast any single generation's needs or failures. Interspersed among the ledgers were letters, correspondence between Edward and dealers, auction houses, and private collectors that spanned decades. The letters revealed a man who operated with extraordinary discretion, purchasing through intermediaries, using accounts that were structured to avoid drawing attention, building his collection item by item with a patience that bordered on obsessive. He had never spoken of this to anyone outside the immediate chain of custody, first his wife, then his son. The secret had passed from hand to hand like a flame sheltered from the wind, protected not by locks or technology, but by the simple, unbreakable bond of trust between people who understood what was at stake. Eleanor sank to the concrete floor, her back against one of the support columns, and allowed the magnitude of what she had found to settle over her. The flashlight rested in her lap, its beam pointed upward, casting a pale circle on the low ceiling. Around her, the cabinets stood in their rows, silent and ordered, containing a fortune that defied anything she had imagined. She thought of her father in that moment with a vividness that constricted her chest. She saw him descending these stairs alone, year after year, checking conditions, replacing batteries and climate systems, updating the ledgers with current valuations, ensuring that every item remained exactly as it had been placed. She saw him climbing back up, sealing the floor behind him, returning to the kitchen where his children ate breakfast and argued about television and complained about chores, carrying the weight of this secret with a composure that never cracked. She understood now why he had been a man of few words, why his silences had always seemed fuller than other people's speech. He had been holding this, all of it, for all of them, and in the end, he had chosen to give it to her. The tears came without warning and without restraint. They were not tears of joy, though joy was there, somewhere beneath the surface. They were tears of recognition, of a grief that had suddenly found its proper shape. Her father had trusted her above all others, and that trust, more than any gold or gemstone or ancient certificate, was the true inheritance. The fortune in the cabinets was extraordinary. The faith that had placed it in her care was beyond price. She remained on the floor for a long time, letting the emotions move through her without resistance. The chamber held her in its silence, patient and indifferent to human feeling, built to endure regardless of what transpired within its walls. When the tears subsided, she felt not emptied but clarified, as if a lens she had been looking through for weeks had finally been wiped clean. She rose, steadied herself, and began the work of documentation. The process took hours. She photographed every cabinet, every shelf, every individual item she could access without risking damage. She recorded the condition of the chamber itself, noting the construction materials, the ventilation channels, the state of the concrete floor, and support columns. She copied pages from the ledgers, careful to handle them with the cotton gloves she had brought for exactly this purpose. Each photograph was labeled with coordinates relative to the chamber's layout, creating a record that could be used to locate any item without entering the space again. As she worked, the scale of the discovery continued to reveal itself. The gold alone, based on the weights recorded in the ledgers and the current market prices she carried in her professional knowledge, represented a value in the tens of millions. The bearer bonds, if still valid and redeemable, could multiply that figure several times over. The gemstones and artwork added layers of value that required specialized appraisal to quantify, but were clearly substantial. And the coins, with their historical provenance and rarity, occupied a category of value that transcended simple metal content, entering the realm of numismatic significance, where individual pieces could command prices far exceeding their weight in gold. She did not attempt to calculate a total. The number would come later, assembled by professionals with the expertise and authority to make such determinations. What she understood, standing in the chamber surrounded by the quiet testimony of her grandfather's foresight and her father's dedication, was that the figure would be transformative, not merely life-changing in the personal sense, but significant enough to alter the dynamics of the family, the community, and perhaps the broader landscape of inherited wealth in the region. She thought of Martin, preparing to convert the house above into a showcase of modern renovation. She thought of Catherine, efficiently liquidating her share of the estate into portable capital. She thought of the neighbors who had offered condolences for her misfortune, The relatives who had whispered about her father's judgment, the clerk at the hardware store who had repeated the word cellar, as if it were synonymous with nothing. None of them had the faintest idea what existed beneath the floor they had all walked over, sat above, and dismissed without a second thought. She recalled a specific conversation at the post-funeral gathering, an uncle whose name she associated more with opinions than with accomplishments, holding court beside the buffet table. He had spoken about Richard's will with the authority of someone who believed proximity to information conferred understanding. The cellar, he had declared to a small audience of nodding relatives, was a sentimental gesture. Richard had always been fond of Eleanor, and the cellar was his way of giving her something without giving her anything of value. A keepsake, a token, something to remember him by, while the real assets went to children who knew what to do with them. The uncle had punctuated this assessment with a shake of his head that conveyed regret for Eleanor and respect for Martin in equal measure. Standing now in the chamber beneath that same cellar, surrounded by a fortune that would render every asset in the visible estate trivial by comparison, Eleanor felt the memory of that conversation dissolve. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet completeness of a truth that needed no defense. Her father had not given her a keepsake. He had given her everything. And the people who had mistaken his judgment for sentiment would soon discover that Richard Hargrove had understood value more deeply than any of them had imagined. The irony was not lost on her, but neither did she savor it. Vindication, she was discovering, tasted less like triumph and more like solitude. The knowledge she now carried set her apart from everyone she knew, and the distance it created was not entirely welcome. She would need to bridge that distance carefully, to manage the revelation in a way that protected the assets, honored her father's intentions, and navigated the inevitable storm of reactions that would follow. She sealed the chamber with the same careful process that had opened it, engaging the pressure points in reverse order and watching as the counterweight system lifted the flagstone panel back into its resting position. The floor closed seamlessly, returning to its appearance of unbroken solidity. Dust settled into the grooves within minutes, erasing the evidence of access as if the opening had never occurred. Before climbing the stairs, Eleanor paused in the cellar and looked around the space with eyes that now understood its true function. Every shelf, every box, every piece of stored equipment had served double duty. They were not merely the accumulated possessions of a family. They were camouflage, the visual noise that ensured anyone who entered the cellar would see exactly what they expected to see and nothing more. Her father had arranged the space above the chamber with the same deliberate care he had applied to the chamber itself, creating a surface reality so thoroughly ordinary that no one, not Martin during his visits, not contractors assessing the renovation, not even Eleanor on her first return, had thought to look beyond it. The genius of the concealment lay not in complexity, but in understanding human behavior. People did not search for what they did not suspect. A cellar filled with old jars and dusty equipment invited neither curiosity nor investigation. It was, by design, the most boring room in the house, and that boredom had been its strongest defense for nearly a century. Eleanor gathered her equipment, checked that nothing had been left behind, and climbed the stairs to the cellar. The space above felt different now, smaller and less significant, a mere anteroom to the true structure that lay beneath it. She locked the side entrance behind her and stood in the morning air, breathing deeply, grounding herself in the physical world that continued to operate according to its ordinary rules while something extraordinary waited below. The drive back to her apartment was conducted in silence. She did not turn on the radio. She did not make calls. The evidence sat in her camera and in the copies she had made of the ledger pages, stored in separate locations within her bag as a precaution that already felt instinctive rather than deliberate. When she arrived home, she transferred everything to her computer, creating encrypted backups that she stored in multiple locations. The habit of redundancy, learned from years of professional work and reinforced by her father's example, guided her without conscious thought. That evening, she began the process of seeking professional assessment. She did not contact local dealers or regional auction houses. The scale of the discovery demanded expertise of a different order. Institutions with the capacity to evaluate collections of this magnitude and the discretion to do so without attracting premature attention. She researched firms that specialized in estate appraisals involving historical assets, comparing their credentials, their client histories, their reputations for confidentiality. She selected 3, each chosen for a specific area of expertise. The first specialized in numismatic evaluation, with a documented history of authenticating and appraising rare coin collections from major estates and museums. The second focused on financial instruments, including historical bonds, certificates, and similar documents, with particular knowledge of bearer instruments issued during the period her grandfather had been most active. The third was a fine art consultancy with experience in assessing works discovered in private collections, including authentication, provenance research, and market valuation. She contacted each firm independently, providing enough information to establish the nature of the inquiry without revealing the full scope of the collection. The responses came quickly, their tone shifting from professional courtesy to heightened interest as the details she provided painted a picture that experienced appraisers recognized immediately. Preliminary consultations were scheduled, each requiring non-disclosure agreements that Eleanor reviewed with the same meticulous attention she applied to everything else. The first appraiser to visit was the numismatic specialist, a woman named Dr. Helen Marchetti, whose career had taken her through the vaults of private collectors and the conservation departments of national museums. Eleanor met her at a neutral location, presenting a selection of photographs and ledger excerpts rather than physical items. The precaution was deliberate. Until she fully understood the legal landscape of her inheritance, she intended to control access to the collection with absolute authority. Dr. Marchetti studied the photographs with an intensity that sharpened visibly as she moved from image to image. Her questions were precise, technical, focused on details that Eleanor had photographed without fully understanding their significance. Mint marks, edge patterns, dye variations, the subtle indicators that separated genuine historical coins from reproductions or later strikes. Eleanor answered what she could and noted what she could not, understanding that the gaps in her knowledge would be filled by the experts she was assembling. When Dr. Marchetti looked up from the photographs, her expression had changed. The professional composure remained, but beneath it was something Eleanor had not expected to see in the face of someone who had spent decades evaluating rare objects. It was astonishment, controlled but unmistakable, the reaction of a person encountering something that exceeded the boundaries of experience. The coins in the photographs, Dr. Marchetti explained carefully, included pieces that had not been seen on the open market in decades. Several appeared to match descriptions of items that had passed through legendary auctions in the early 20th century and then vanished into private hands. If authenticated, their individual values would range from the substantial to the extraordinary, with certain pieces potentially qualifying as among the finest known examples of their type. The collection as a whole, based on what the photographs suggested, represented a numismatic holding of international significance. Eleanor listened without interruption, absorbing the assessment with the same discipline she had applied throughout the process. When Dr. Marchetti asked where the collection was held, Eleanor provided only that it was in a secure, climate-controlled environment. The answer was truthful, carefully bounded, and sufficient for the moment. Trust would be extended incrementally, earned through demonstrated competence and discretion. The financial instrument specialist, a senior partner at a firm whose name appeared regularly in reports of major estate settlements, conducted his preliminary review remotely, examining high-resolution scans of the bearer bonds and certificates Eleanor had photographed. His assessment was delivered in language that combined legal caution with barely suppressed enthusiasm. The instruments, he explained, represented a class of financial asset that had become increasingly rare as governments and institutions retired older forms of bearer documentation. Many had continued to accrue value through the decades, their terms fulfilled automatically by the issuing institutions regardless of whether the physical certificates had been presented for redemption. The potential values he described made Eleanor set down her pen and stare at the wall of her apartment for several minutes. The bonds alone, if validated and redeemed through proper legal channels, could represent a figure that dwarfed the combined value of every other asset in her father's estate. The financial specialist emphasized that verification would require direct examination of the physical documents, authentication of signatures and seals, and coordination with the relevant financial institutions. The process would take time, but the preliminary indicators, he said, were remarkably strong. The art consultant was the last to respond, and her assessment arrived in the form of a carefully worded letter that Eleanor read 3 times before setting it down. The paintings and drawings in the photographs, the consultant wrote, bore characteristics consistent with works by artists whose pieces commanded significant prices at auction. Several compositions appeared to correspond with entries in catalog databases that listed works as being in unknown private collections, a designation that in the art world signified not loss, but concealment. If the works could be authenticated through direct examination, their combined value would place them firmly within the category of major discoveries, the kind that attracted institutional attention and reshaped scholarly understanding of an artist's body of work. Eleanor assembled the 3 preliminary assessments on her kitchen table and read them side by side, allowing the numbers and language to combine into a single picture. The estimates varied in precision, each specialist hedging according to the standards of their field. But even the most conservative projections, stripped of enthusiasm and anchored to verifiable data points, painted a picture that was staggering in its clarity. The collection beneath the cellar floor, assembled over decades by her grandfather and preserved for decades more by her father, held an estimated combined value that approached and potentially exceeded $326 million. The number sat on the page like a sentence in a language she had never spoken, grammatically correct but emotionally incomprehensible. 326 million. She said it aloud once, testing the weight of the words in the quiet apartment, and found that they carried a reality she could feel but not yet fully absorb. The figure was not an abstraction. It represented specific objects stored in specific cabinets in a specific chamber beneath a specific cellar in a house on a hillside where she had grown up. Every coin, every bond, every gemstone and canvas was real, tangible, documented, and waiting. She pushed back from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot of her modest apartment complex, at the car she had driven for 8 years, at the small patch of grass where someone had left a child's bicycle on its side. The ordinary world continued to function according to its ordinary rules, unaware that a woman standing at a second-floor window was processing information that would alter everything about her place within it. The contrast between the view and the number on the table behind her felt almost absurd, as if 2 realities had been placed side by side and asked to coexist without explanation. $326 million. The sum was larger than the annual budget of the county she lived in. It exceeded the combined net worth of every family she had ever known. It was the kind of figure that appeared in news reports about corporate transactions or national infrastructure projects, not in the lives of women who drove used cars and rented apartments and worried about whether their next restoration contract would cover the following month's expenses. It was real. The specialist had confirmed it independently, using methodologies refined over decades of professional practice. Their estimates converged on a figure that none of them described as surprising given the quality and provenance of the items they had reviewed. What surprised them, each had noted in their own way, was not the value itself, but the fact that such a collection had remained unknown for so long. In their experience, holdings of this magnitude eventually surfaced through estate proceedings, institutional inquiries, or the simple passage of time. That this one had remained hidden for nearly a century spoke to a level of planning and discipline that they regarded as extraordinary. Eleanor walked back to the table and sat down. She placed her hands flat on the surface, pressing them against the wood as if to confirm that solid things still existed, that the physical world had not reorganized itself around the number that now occupied its center. She looked at the assessment documents, at the careful language the specialist had used, at the figures they had underlined and annotated with qualifications that could not diminish their impact. $326 million. Written in different hands, arrived at through different methodologies, confirmed by different expertise, but converging on the same conclusion with the inevitability of water finding a single drain. She thought about what the number meant in terms she could understand. It meant that the apartment she was renting, the one with the unreliable heating and the dripping faucet and the thin walls that carried other people's conversations into her nights, could be replaced not with a better apartment, but with anything. It meant that the professional contracts she worried about, the ones that determined whether she could afford groceries or gasoline or the simple dignity of a life, not governed by counting, no longer mattered in the way they had mattered yesterday. It meant that the calculations she performed each evening, the quiet arithmetic of survival that had become as habitual as breathing, were no longer necessary. The number did not simply change her financial position. It erased the framework within which financial position had meaning. She thought about the gas station, the evening when the transaction had nearly breached her self-imposed minimum. She thought about the community event, the laughter that had followed her out the side door and into the parking lot where she had sat in her car with dry eyes and a breaking heart. She thought about Catherine's advice to sell the cellar back to Martin, about the modest sum that transaction would have yielded, about the life of careful diminishment that some would have purchased. Each memory now carried a second layer, a shadow narrative that ran alongside the original, like a translation into a language she had not known she would learn. The woman at the gas station had been standing on $326 million. The woman at the community event had been carrying a secret worth more than every house in the county combined. The woman Catherine had advised to sell had been holding an inheritance that would have rendered Catherine's own share invisible by comparison. The absurdity of it pressed against her chest until she laughed. The sound startled her. She could not remember the last time she had laughed alone, without an audience or a reason that required performance. This laugh was involuntary, drawn from a place deeper than humor, a place where the accumulated pressure of months of doubt and restraint and quiet suffering finally found an outlet that was not tears. She laughed until her ribs ached, until her eyes watered, until the sound faded into a silence that felt different from any silence she had known before. It was the silence of a person who no longer needed to be afraid. She closed her eyes and let the implications settle. The cash. Bequest her father had left her, the modest sum that had seemed like an afterthought beside Martin's house and Catherine's investments, now revealed itself as something else entirely. It was not the inheritance. It was the operating budget, the funds she would need to manage the process of authentication, appraisal, and eventual realization of the true inheritance hidden below. Her father had thought of everything. He had provided her with just enough to sustain herself while she did the work he knew she would do, the work only she could do, the work of uncovering, understanding, and protecting the fortune he had spent his life guarding in silence. The weight of the responsibility pressed against her, but did not crush her. It settled onto her shoulders with a familiarity that felt almost genetic, as if the capacity to carry such knowledge had been bred into her through generations of Hargrove discipline. She understood now that the days ahead would bring challenges she could not fully anticipate: legal complexities, family dynamics, public attention, and 1,000 small decisions that accompanied any discovery of this magnitude. But she also understood something simpler and more sustaining. She was not alone in this. Her father stood with her in the precise handwriting of his notes, in the carefully maintained mechanisms of the chamber, in the choice he had made to place this responsibility in her hands and no one else's. Her grandfather stood with her in the quality of the construction, in the foresight of the collection, in the quiet conviction that true wealth was not displayed but preserved. 3 generations of care had brought this moment into being, and Eleanor, the daughter who had been pitted for receiving the cellar, was the one who would carry it forward. She gathered the assessment documents, secured them alongside her other materials, and prepared for what came next. The discovery was made. The value was confirmed. The secret that had lived beneath the Hargrove house for nearly a century was ready to emerge into the light. What remained was the question of how it would change everything and everyone it touched. She thought about the conversation she would need to have with Martin. She imagined his face, the way his confidence would fracture when he understood that the renovation he was planning would need to accommodate a discovery beneath the cellar floor that transformed the entire property's significance. She imagined the shift in his posture, the recalculation happening behind his eyes as the house he had claimed as his birthright was suddenly redefined by what existed beneath it. Martin had always measured value in visibility, in what could be seen, displayed, and admired. The chamber beneath the cellar represented a kind of value he had never been equipped to recognize. She thought about Catherine, whose reaction would be swifter and more complex. Catherine would see the financial implications immediately, her mind racing through structures and strategies before the emotional reality had a chance to register. She would ask about taxes, about legal standing, about the process of converting historical assets into liquid capital. Her questions would be practical and penetrating, and beneath them would run a current of recalculation that touched not just the estate, but her understanding of the father who had divided it. And she thought about the community, the neighbors who had whispered, the relatives who had judged, the quiet consensus that had formed around the idea that Eleanor Hargrove had been left behind by her father's will. That consensus was about to be shattered by a truth that none of them had suspected. A truth that proved Richard Hargrove had seen further and understood more deeply than anyone who had presumed to interpret his intentions. Eleanor stood at the window of her apartment as night settled over the ordinary landscape outside. Behind her, the assessment documents lay on the table, their numbers and language forming a bridge between the life she had known and the life that was beginning. Ahead of her lay conversations that would be difficult, decisions that would be consequential, and a responsibility that would demand everything her father had spent a lifetime teaching her. She was ready, not because the discovery had made her wealthy, but because the journey to it had proven something that no amount of money could purchase. She had been chosen not for what she could take, but for what she could be trusted to protect. And that trust, passed down through 3 generations of quiet, deliberate care, was the foundation on which everything else would be built. And that question, Eleanor knew, would begin to answer itself the moment she told her family what their father had truly left behind. Eleanor chose the setting for the conversation with the same deliberateness she had applied to every other step of the process. She did not want to meet at the house. The house belonged to Martin now, and holding the conversation, there would place the revelation within his territory, allowing him to frame it as an extension of his inheritance rather than a correction of his assumptions. She did not want to meet at Catherine's city apartment either, where the discussion would be filtered through Catherine's instinct for transaction and converted into a negotiation before its emotional weight had a chance to register. Instead, she chose the office of the attorney she had retained 3 days earlier. A neutral space, a professional space, a space where the truth could be presented on its own terms, supported by documentation and witnessed by someone whose role was clarity rather than sentiment. The attorney, a woman named Rebecca Caldwell, whose reputation in estate law was built on precision and discretion, had reviewed the preliminary assessments and confirmed what Eleanor already understood. The cellar and its contents belonged to Eleanor under the terms of the will. The language Richard had used, the lower structure and its contents, was unambiguous in its legal meaning. Whatever existed within or beneath the cellar was part of Eleanor's inheritance, regardless of how anyone else chose to interpret the will's intent. Martin arrived first, 10 minutes early, his suit pressed, his expression carrying the confident neutrality of a man accustomed to controlling the rooms he entered. He greeted Eleanor with the same brief courtesy he had maintained since the reading of the will, a nod that acknowledged her presence without engaging with it. He shook Rebecca Caldwell's hand and took the chair closest to the window, positioning himself where the light favored him. Catherine arrived precisely on time, dressed in the understated elegance that served as her professional uniform. She exchanged measured pleasantries with Rebecca and sat beside Martin, her posture upright, her attention already calibrated for negotiation. She carried a leather portfolio that Eleanor knew contained her own copies of the will and whatever financial documents she deemed relevant. Eleanor sat across from them, the table between them holding nothing except a single folder. She had considered bringing the full documentation, the photographs, the ledger copies, the specialist assessments. She had decided against it. The folder contained only what was necessary to establish the discovery's reality and its implications. Everything else would follow in its own time, through its own channels, controlled by its own requirements. This meeting was not about evidence. It was about truth. She began without preamble. She told them about the cellar. She described the rectangular panel on the flagstone floor, the pressure points, the counterweight mechanism that their father had maintained for decades. She explained the lower chamber, its construction, its climate-controlled cabinets, its contents. She spoke clearly, without hurry, allowing each detail to settle before introducing the next. Her voice carried no triumph and no apology. It carried the same steady discipline that had guided her through every stage of the discovery. Martin's expression changed slowly. The confident neutrality dissolved by degrees, replaced first by confusion, then by something harder that resisted classification. His jaw tightened. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, pressed into the leather with increasing force. He did not interrupt. He did not speak at all. The silence from his side of the table grew heavier with each sentence Eleanor delivered, compressing into a density that seemed to alter the air in the room. Catherine's reaction was swifter and more contained. Her eyes narrowed fractionally when Eleanor mentioned the bearer bonds, narrowed further at the description of the gold, and reached their sharpest focus when the specialist assessments were introduced. She reached for the folder without asking, a gesture that Rebecca Caldwell intercepted with a quiet hand and a shake of the head. The documents would be shared in due course. For now, they were Eleanor's to present. When Eleanor spoke the number, $326 million, the room became very still. The words hung in the air between the three siblings like a physical object, too large to be absorbed and too real to be dismissed. Martin stared at the table. Catherine stared at Eleanor. Neither of them moved. The silence lasted long enough for Eleanor to feel its weight pressing against her chest. She had imagined this moment in different ways over the preceding days, rehearsing reactions, preparing responses, anticipating the complex emotional landscape that the revelation would create. None of her preparations matched the reality. The silence was not anger. It was not disbelief. It was the sound of two people confronting the realization that they had fundamentally misunderstood their father, his will, and a sister they had spent months dismissing. Martin spoke first. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of the casual authority he typically wore. He asked whether Eleanor was certain. She confirmed that she was, citing the three independent specialist assessments and the documentation that supported them. He asked whether their father had left any instructions beyond the drawings. She explained the ledgers, the correspondence, the careful record of every acquisition and its provenance. She described the decades of maintenance, the quiet trips to the cellar, the hours of work that no one had questioned because no one had thought to ask. Martin absorbed this in silence, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the table. When he looked up, his expression carried something Eleanor had not expected. It was not resentment, though resentment would come later in different forms and at different intensities. It was recognition, the slow, uncomfortable recognition that his father had seen something in Eleanor that Martin had never been willing to acknowledge, a capacity for patience, for discretion, for the kind of stewardship that wealth of this magnitude demanded. Martin had been given the house because he could be trusted to maintain a building. Eleanor had been given the cellar because she could be trusted to maintain a secret. Catherine recovered faster, as Eleanor had predicted. Her first question was about legal standing, which Rebecca Caldwell addressed with the calm authority of someone who had already prepared for exactly this inquiry. The will's language was clear. The cellar and its contents belonged to Eleanor. The lower chamber, being structurally part of the cellar, fell within the same provision. Any attempt to contest this interpretation would require demonstrating that Richard Hargrove had not intended the language he had used, a burden of proof that no competent attorney would recommend pursuing given the specificity of the phrasing and the supporting documentation. Catherine's second question was about access. The chamber existed beneath the house that Martin now owned. Physical access required passage through Martin's property. This created a practical dependency that Catherine recognized immediately as leverage, not for herself, but as a potential complication that would need to be resolved. Rebecca Caldwell acknowledged the issue and explained that easement provisions and access agreements were standard in such situations. The legal framework existed to ensure that Eleanor's rights to her inheritance were not obstructed by the physical location of the assets. Martin shifted in his chair, his posture rigid with an internal struggle that Eleanor could read in the tension of his shoulders and the deliberate control of his breathing. She knew her brother well enough to understand what was happening behind his careful silence. Martin was not a cruel man. He was a proud one, and pride, when confronted with evidence of its own blindness, did not surrender gracefully. He was recalculating not just the estate, but his understanding of every interaction he had ever had with their father, every assumption he had made about his own place within the family, every casual dismissal of Eleanor's share that now revealed itself as a monument to his own failure of perception. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a roughness that had nothing to do with anger. He asked Eleanor why their father had not told him. The question was simple, but its depth was immense. It asked not just about information, but about trust, about the hierarchy of confidence that Richard had established among his children without any of them knowing it existed. Eleanor answered honestly. She did not know why their father had chosen secrecy over disclosure. She could only observe that the secrecy had been maintained with the same care as the collection itself, suggesting that Richard had believed concealment was necessary for protection. Protection from what, or from whom, remained a question she could not answer with certainty. Catherine leaned forward then, her composure still intact, but visibly strained at the edges. She asked a question that revealed more about her own reckoning than she perhaps intended. She asked whether their father had ever considered dividing the collection among all three of them. The question was not about fairness. It was about recognition, about whether Catherine's exclusion from the secret had been deliberate or incidental. Eleanor could offer no comfort on that point. The ledgers, the drawings, the will itself, all pointed to a single conclusion. Richard had intended for one person to hold the responsibility, and he had chosen that person with the same precision he applied to everything else. The silence that followed Catherine's question lasted longer than any that had preceded it. In that silence, Eleanor could hear the sound of assumptions collapsing, of narratives built over months and years folding under the weight of a reality none of them had anticipated. Martin had assumed his inheritance was the most valuable because it was the most visible. Catherine had assumed her share was the most practical because it was the most liquid. Both had assumed that Eleanor's portion was the least significant because it appeared to be the least substantial. All three assumptions had been wrong, and the wrongness was not partial or debatable. It was absolute. Rebecca Caldwell intervened gently, guiding the conversation toward the practical framework that would govern the next steps. She outlined the authentication process, the legal protections already in place, and the timeline for formal appraisal. She emphasized that Eleanor's ownership was established and that any questions about access or management would be addressed through proper legal channels. Her tone was professional and neutral, but Eleanor sensed the quiet authority beneath it, the unmistakable message that the discovery would be handled with rigor and that no pressure, familial or otherwise, would be permitted to compromise Eleanor's rights. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By its end, the emotional landscape had shifted in ways that would take weeks to fully resolve. Martin left without the confident bearing he had arrived with, his stride slower, his gaze directed downward. Catherine departed with her portfolio tucked under her arm, her expression revealing nothing except the intense focus of a mind already working through implications that extended far beyond the conference room. Eleanor remained with Rebecca Caldwell for another hour, reviewing next steps, establishing timelines, and confirming the security measures that would protect the collection until formal authentication could be completed. Word spread. Eleanor had not intended for the discovery to become public knowledge so quickly, but the dynamics of a small community made discretion difficult when the principals involved were already subjects of local interest. Within a week, the essential details had traveled through the same channels that had carried the earlier narrative of Eleanor's misfortune, transformed by repetition and speculation into a story that grew more dramatic with each retelling. The community's reaction mirrored the family's in miniature, a mixture of astonishment, recalculation, and discomfort. People who had offered Eleanor their condolences now found themselves in the awkward position of having expressed sympathy for a situation that had turned out to be the opposite of what they assumed. The woman at the cafe who had praised Martin's capable hands suddenly discovered an interest in Eleanor's restoration work that she had never previously expressed. The hardware store clerk, who had repeated the word cellar with such bewildered pity, now spoke of Richard Hargrove's brilliance as if he had always suspected something extraordinary lay beneath the property. Eleanor observed these shifts without bitterness, but also without the satisfaction she might have expected. The community's reversal was not hypocrisy, exactly. It was the natural response of people adjusting their understanding to accommodate new information. They had not been malicious in their earlier judgments. They had simply been wrong, limited by the same assumptions that had blinded Martin and Catherine, the belief that value was visible and that worth could be measured by what was displayed rather than what was concealed. There were moments, however, when the reversal carried an edge that was harder to dismiss. A neighbor who had openly told others that Eleanor had been cheated by her father's will now appeared at her apartment door with a casserole dish and a smile that suggested years of friendship rather than months of pity. Eleanor accepted the dish, thanked her, and closed the door without inviting her inside. The gesture was not unkind, but it established a boundary that the neighbor understood without explanation. Kindness offered after fortune arrived carried a different weight than kindness offered during hardship, and Eleanor had learned to tell the difference. At the grocery store, a man she barely recognized stopped her in the produce aisle to tell her that he had always known Richard Hargrove was a genius. The statement was delivered with such conviction that Eleanor almost believed he believed it himself. She smiled, nodded, and selected her tomatoes with the calm of someone who had stopped measuring her worth by other people's opinions. The man continued talking, offering unsolicited advice about investment strategies and tax shelters, until Eleanor excused herself with a politeness that concealed its finality. Martin's wife, who had described Eleanor as the sentimental one at the funeral gathering, sent a handwritten note expressing admiration for Eleanor's perseverance and suggesting that they arrange a family dinner to celebrate the discovery. The note was gracious in its language and transparent in its motivation. Eleanor replied with equal grace and no commitment, understanding that some invitations were extended not for the pleasure of company, but for the proximity to significance. The relatives who had whispered at the funeral gathering reappeared with adjusted narratives. The uncle who had declared Eleanor's inheritance a sentimental gesture now described Richard as a man of extraordinary foresight, as if his earlier assessment had been a temporary misunderstanding rather than a confident pronouncement. Cousins who had avoided Eleanor's calls during the difficult months following the will's reading now reached out with congratulations that carried the faintly metallic taste of self-interest. Each interaction required Eleanor to navigate the gap between generosity and gullibility, extending grace without surrendering judgment. She managed these encounters with the same disciplined calm she had applied throughout the process. She did not correct people who revised their memories. She did not remind anyone of what they had said or assumed. She understood that vindication, real vindication, did not require the humiliation of those who had been wrong. It required only the quiet, undeniable presence of truth, standing where dismissal had once stood, speaking for itself. The months that followed were consumed by the practical work of authentication and realization. The specialist firms Eleanor had engaged expanded their assessments into full evaluations, each requiring controlled access to the chamber and its contents. Dr. Marchetti spent 3 days in the lower chamber cataloging the coin collection, her team working with gloved hands and calibrated instruments under lights that Eleanor had installed specifically for the purpose. The numismatic evaluation confirmed and exceeded the preliminary estimate. Several pieces were identified as unique surviving examples of their type, their provenance traceable through auction records and collector correspondence that matched perfectly with Edward Hargrove's ledgers. The bearer bonds underwent a separate process of verification that required coordination with financial institutions across 3 countries. The work was painstaking, each instrument examined for authenticity, its terms verified against institutional records, its current value calculated based on decades of accumulated returns. The financial specialist's preliminary enthusiasm proved justified. The bonds represented a class of asset that had appreciated steadily and silently, their value compounding in the darkness of the chamber with the same patient inevitability that characterized everything the Hargrove family had built. The artwork authentication drew attention from the broader cultural community. 2 of the paintings were identified as previously unknown works by artists whose pieces appeared in major museum collections worldwide. Their discovery prompted academic interest that extended beyond monetary valuation into questions of art history, provenance research, and the hidden networks of private collecting that had operated throughout the 20th century. Eleanor cooperated with scholars and curators selectively, providing access to documentation while maintaining control over the physical works themselves. Through all of this, the legal framework held firm. Rebecca Caldwell navigated the complex intersection of inheritance law, tax regulation, and asset management with the competence Eleanor had relied upon from the beginning. The will's language proved as robust as Richard Hargrove had intended. No challenge was raised that could not be addressed by the plain meaning of the words he had chosen. The cellar and its contents belonged to Eleanor. The lower structure and everything within it was hers to manage, protect, and ultimately to use as she saw fit. Eleanor made her first significant financial decision 6 weeks after the authentication process began. She paid off the debts that had accumulated during the months of uncertainty, clearing every balance with the proceeds from a single bond redeemed through proper channels. The transaction was unremarkable in the context of the collection's total value, but transformative in the context of her daily life. The constant, low-grade anxiety of financial vulnerability, the background noise that had accompanied every decision since her father's death, fell silent. In its place was a quiet that felt unfamiliar but welcome, the quiet of a life no longer governed by scarcity. Her second decision was more deliberate. She established a trust, structured with the same long-term vision that had guided her grandfather's original collection. The trust was designed not to spend the wealth, but to preserve it, generating returns that would sustain future generations without depleting the principal. She named it after her father, a gesture that carried no sentiment and all meaning. Richard Hargrove had spent his life protecting a fortune he never used. The trust ensured that his discipline would continue to define how the wealth was managed, long after the discovery had faded from public attention. Her third decision surprised everyone, including herself. She approached Martin with a proposal that Rebecca Caldwell had helped her draft. The house and the land would remain Martin's under the terms of the will, but the cellar and its chamber would be preserved as a permanent feature of the property, maintained by the trust and accessible under conditions that ensured its security. In exchange, Martin would receive a share of the trust's annual returns, sufficient to fund the renovation he had planned and to secure his own financial position for life. The proposal was generous but not unconditional. It required Martin to accept that the cellar's significance exceeded anything the house above it could claim, and that Eleanor's stewardship of the collection was not a negotiation but a fact. Martin accepted. The conversation in which he did so was the most difficult either of them had experienced, not because of conflict, but because of what it required both of them to acknowledge. Martin admitted, in language stripped of pride and cushioned by nothing, that he had been wrong. Not about the will, not about the property, but about Eleanor. He had spent years seeing her as the sibling who lacked ambition, who preferred quiet work over visible achievement, who remained close to their father out of dependency rather than strength. The discovery had dismantled that narrative completely, and in its place stood a picture of Eleanor that Martin was still learning to see clearly. He told her something that evening that she had not expected to hear. He described a memory from their childhood, a winter afternoon when their father had taken Eleanor to the cellar to show her how to mix mortar for stone repair. Martin had been invited, but had declined, choosing instead to watch television with a friend who was visiting. He had not thought about that afternoon in decades. Now, sitting across from Eleanor with the weight of $326 million resting between them, the memory returned with a vividness that unsettled him. Their father had not simply been teaching Eleanor a skill. He had been testing her temperament, observing whether she possessed the patience and attention to detail that the family's true inheritance would one day require. Martin had failed that test without knowing it existed. Eleanor had passed it without knowing the stakes. The admission cost Martin something visible. His shoulders dropped slightly, his hands opened on the table, and for a moment the confident eldest brother disappeared, replaced by a man confronting the limits of his own self-knowledge. Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand briefly on his. The gesture said everything that words would have complicated. It said that the past could not be changed, but the future did not have to repeat it. It said that inheritance was not a competition, and that their father had loved all three of them, each according to what they needed and what they could bear. Eleanor accepted his acknowledgement with the grace their father would have expected. She did not minimize Martin's error or amplify her own vindication. She simply received his words, held them briefly, and then moved the conversation forward to practical matters. The moment was not about triumph. It was about restoration, the careful rebuilding of a relationship that had been damaged by assumptions neither of them had thought to question. Catherine's accommodation was different in character, but equally significant. She restructured her own financial holdings to complement the trust Eleanor had established, contributing expertise in portfolio management and institutional relationships that Eleanor's preservation-focused approach lacked. The collaboration was professional rather than personal, but it carried an undercurrent of respect that had not existed before. Catherine had spent her career converting assets into advantage. Eleanor's discovery had shown her a model of wealth that operated on entirely different principles, one that valued endurance over efficiency and patience over profit. The lesson was uncomfortable but undeniable. The community adjusted more slowly, as communities always did. The Hargrove discovery became a local landmark of sorts, a story that was told and retold in hardware stores and cafes and at kitchen tables where families discussed the nature of inheritance and the meaning of value. The story evolved with each telling, acquiring embellishments and losing details, but its essential shape remained intact. A woman had been given what everyone believed was worthless. She had been mocked for accepting it. And beneath the surface of what appeared to be nothing, she had found everything. The hardware store clerk became an unlikely narrator of the story, retelling it to customers with a degree of detail that grew more elaborate each week. He described the cellar as if he had seen it himself, adding dramatic flourishes about the weight of the gold and the age of the paintings that bore no resemblance to Eleanor's measured accounts. She heard one of these retellings secondhand, from a client who mentioned it during a site visit and smiled without correcting the record. Stories, she had learned, belonged to the people who told them. The truth belonged to her. The bank manager who had processed her modest transactions for months, watching her balance shrink with the quiet concern of a man trained to assess risk, now treated her with a deference that bordered on theatrical. He invited her to his office, offered coffee in a cup that did not match the one she had been served before, and discussed investment options with the careful enthusiasm of someone who recognized that a relationship he had nearly discarded was now the most significant one in his portfolio. Eleanor listened politely, accepted the coffee, and retained Rebecca Caldwell's firm to manage all financial matters. The bank manager's disappointment was visible but brief, replaced by the practiced composure of a man who understood that some opportunities were lost before they were recognized. Local journalists requested interviews. Eleanor declined them all, offering instead a brief written statement that acknowledged the discovery without providing details sufficient to satisfy curiosity or invite further inquiry. The statement described the collection as a family legacy of historical and cultural significance, managed in accordance with her father's wishes. The language was deliberate, chosen to establish a narrative of stewardship rather than windfall, of responsibility rather than fortune. She understood that public perception, once set, was difficult to redirect, and she intended the perception to align with the truth her father had embodied. This was not a lottery win. It was the product of 3 generations of discipline, and it would be managed accordingly. The property itself became an object of fascination. Drivers slowed as they passed the Hargrove house, their eyes searching for some visible sign of the wealth hidden beneath it. They found none. The house looked as it always had, stone and timber and age, its exterior unchanged by the extraordinary revelation it contained. Martin, to his credit, did not alter his renovation plans in ways that drew attention to the cellar or its contents. The work proceeded according to the original timeline, focused on the house itself rather than what lay below. Whether this restraint was born of respect for Eleanor's wishes or of his own desire to maintain control over at least one aspect of the property's public image, Eleanor did not ask. The result was the same. The house remained a house. The secret remained, in the ways that mattered most, a secret. There were, of course, those who resented the discovery. Not openly, not in ways that could be addressed directly, but in the subtle withdrawals and redirections that characterized small-town displeasure. A neighbor who had been friendly for years stopped waving when Eleanor drove past. A former colleague declined a project collaboration without explanation, citing scheduling conflicts that both of them knew did not exist. These reactions carried a logic that Eleanor understood without accepting. Sudden fortune in a community of modest means disrupted the equilibrium that people relied upon for their sense of order. Eleanor's wealth did not diminish anyone else's, but it altered the scale against which they measured their own, and that alteration was felt as loss even when nothing had been taken. She absorbed these reactions as she had absorbed the earlier mockery, with patience and without resentment. The people who withdrew would either return or they would not. The relationships that survived the adjustment would be stronger for having been tested. The ones that did not survive had perhaps been less substantial than she had believed. In either case, the outcome was not within her control, and Eleanor had learned from her father that energy spent on what could not be controlled was energy wasted. Eleanor used a portion of the trust's returns to fund projects that reflected her own values and her father's example. A restoration program for historical properties in the region, providing resources for families who lacked the means to maintain structures that carried cultural and architectural significance. A scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in preservation, conservation, and heritage management. A community archive that documented the history of the area with the same meticulous care Richard Hargrove had applied to his own records. Each initiative was designed to endure, to generate value that extended beyond the immediate and into the future, exactly as the collection beneath the cellar had done for nearly a century. The changes in her daily life were profound but measured, reflecting the same philosophy of restraint that had defined the collection's existence. She purchased a modest home on the outskirts of town, a stone cottage that shared something of the character of the Hargrove house without competing with its scale. The cottage had good bones and needed restoration, exactly the kind of project that gave her purpose and satisfaction. She worked on it herself in the evenings, fitting stone, repairing timber, applying the skills her father had taught her in a building that was entirely her own. She replaced her aging car with something reliable but not ostentatious, choosing function over display with a consistency that bemused those who expected wealth to express itself in visible excess. She upgraded her professional equipment, investing in tools and technology that expanded the scope of her restoration work. She accepted fewer contracts, but chose them more carefully, selecting projects that aligned with her values rather than her financial needs. The freedom to choose was, she discovered, a form of wealth that exceeded any number in a bank account. Her health improved. The chronic tension that had lived in her shoulders and jaw for months, the physical manifestation of sustained anxiety, gradually released as the financial pressure that had produced it dissolved. She slept deeply for the first time since her father's death, her nights no longer interrupted by calculations and contingencies. She ate meals without rushing, walked without urgency, and found herself noticing details in the landscape that stress had rendered invisible. The golden light on autumn leaves. The particular silence of early morning before the world assembled its noise. The way old stone held warmth long after the sun had moved on. These were small changes, individually insignificant, but together they composed a transformation that went deeper than any financial statement could capture. Eleanor was becoming the person her father had believed she already was, the person whose patience and discipline and quiet courage had earned the most extraordinary trust a parent could bestow. She did not move back into the house. The decision was deliberate and consistent with her understanding of what the inheritance truly meant. The house was Martin's. The cellar was hers. And the chamber beneath the cellar, with its climate-controlled cabinets and its silent testimony to 3 generations of care, was not a place to live. It was a place to protect. She visited it regularly, descending the familiar stairs and activating the mechanism with the same careful sequence her father had used, checking conditions, updating records, ensuring that the collection remained exactly as it had been found. The work was quiet and solitary, performed with a reverence that had nothing to do with the monetary value of the objects and everything to do with the trust they represented. On one of these visits, late in the autumn of the year following the discovery, Eleanor sat in the chamber with her back against the same support column where she had first allowed herself to cry. The cabinets surrounded her in their ordered rows, their contents cataloged and authenticated, their value confirmed by experts whose reputations depended on accuracy. The concrete floor was cool beneath her, the air perfectly still, the silence absolute. She thought about her father. She thought about the years he had spent in this space, alone, maintaining what no one else knew existed. She thought about the weight of that secret, the discipline it demanded, the loneliness it must have imposed. She thought about the moment he had drafted his will, choosing the words that would place this burden in her hands, trusting that she would understand what he could not explain. She thought about his hands. Large, careful hands that had mixed mortar and turned pages and held hers when she was small enough to need holding. Hands that had sealed this floor 1,000 times, never rushing, never careless, never doubting that the work mattered even when no one else would ever see it. She understood now that her father's silence had not been cold or distant, as she had sometimes feared during the difficult months after his death. It had been full of knowledge, full of responsibility, full of a love so profound that it could only be expressed through trust rather than words. She thought about her mother, who had died when Eleanor was 17. Had she known? The ledgers contained no reference to her, no letters addressed to her, no indication that she had ever descended these stairs. Yet Eleanor found it difficult to believe that a woman who had shared Richard's life for 30 years had been entirely unaware of the hours he spent in the cellar. Perhaps she had known and chosen not to ask. Perhaps the secret had been held between them in the way that long marriages sometimes hold things, in silence that is not absence but agreement, a shared understanding that some truths are better protected by 2 people who never speak of them than by one person who tries to carry them alone. The thought brought a new dimension of grief that Eleanor had not anticipated. If her mother had known, then the secret had been orphaned twice, losing first one guardian and then another before finding its way to Eleanor. The responsibility she carried was not just her father's legacy. It was her mother's silence. It was her grandfather's vision. It was the accumulated weight of a family's best judgment, compressed into a chamber beneath a cellar that the world had dismissed as worthless. She thought about the letter she had found in the final ledger, written in her father's hand, addressed to no one and everyone. It was not a letter of instruction. It was a letter of faith. Richard had written that he believed the collection would outlast every challenge, every misunderstanding, every failure of judgment that the family might produce. He wrote that wealth, true wealth, was not measured in currency, but in the capacity to protect what mattered across generations. He wrote that he had chosen Eleanor not because she was the most ambitious or the most practical of his children, but because she was the most patient. Patience, he wrote, was the rarest form of courage, and the only one that time could not defeat. Eleanor held the letter in her hands and read it once more, as she had done many times before. The words had not changed. Their meaning deepened with each reading, settling into her understanding like mortar into stone, filling gaps she had not known existed. Her father had seen her clearly, more clearly than she had seen herself, and in seeing her, he had given her not just a fortune, but a purpose. She replaced the letter in its ledger, closed the cabinet, and climbed the stairs. The cellar welcomed her back with its familiar clutter, its ordinary appearance concealing the extraordinary truth beneath. She sealed the floor, gathered her things, and walked out into the autumn air. She paused on the path between the house and the driveway, looking back at the structure that had shaped her childhood and defined her family's identity for 3 generations. The house was beautiful in the late afternoon light, its stone walls catching the warmth of the lowering sun, its windows reflecting the sky in shades of amber and rose. It was Martin's now, and he would care for it in his way, with renovation and modernization and the kind of visible improvement that satisfied his need to be seen as a capable steward. The house deserved that care. It had earned it through 90 years of standing firm against weather and time and the quiet dramas of the family it sheltered. But the house was not the Hargrove legacy, not the real one. The real legacy lay beneath it, in a chamber built by a man who understood that the greatest fortunes were not the ones that impressed onlookers, but the ones that endured beyond them. Edward Hargrove had built his vault in the same decade that had seen banks fail and markets collapse and families lose everything they had accumulated over generations. He had watched the visible economy disintegrate and had drawn from that watching a conclusion so simple it bordered on radical. If the world above could not be trusted to protect wealth, then wealth must be placed where the world above could not reach it. Beneath stone, beneath silence, beneath the assumption that nothing of value could exist in a place so thoroughly unremarkable. Her father had understood that lesson and had devoted his life to its maintenance. Now Eleanor understood it too, not as an idea she had been told, but as a truth she had lived. She had been the unremarkable one, the sibling no one envied, the daughter whose inheritance had been judged worthless by every measure the visible world applied. And she had endured, as the chamber had endured, as the collection within it had endured, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when the surface would open and the truth would rise into the light. The hillside was golden with late light, the trees turning color in the slow, patient way that trees always did. The house stood above her, its stone walls darkened by the same weather that had touched them for 90 years. Somewhere inside, Martin was reviewing renovation plans. Somewhere in the city, Catherine was managing portfolios. And here, standing between the house and the horizon, Eleanor held the knowledge that the most valuable thing the Hargrove family had ever possessed was not a house or an account or a parcel of land. It was the discipline to build something extraordinary and the patience to wait for the right person to find it. She walked to her car, started the engine, and drove down the hill toward the life she was building, a life shaped not by what had been taken from her, but by what had been entrusted to her. The road ahead was long and uncertain, as all roads were. But beneath her feet, beneath the ground she had learned to read with her father's eyes, the foundation was solid. The seasons turned, as they always did on the hillside, with a rhythm that predated the house and would outlast it. Winter arrived with the particular silence that heavy snowfall imposed on the landscape, muffling sounds, softening edges, turning the familiar into something briefly unfamiliar. Eleanor watched it from the window of her stone cottage, the one she had purchased with the proceeds of a single bearer bond whose redemption had required 3 weeks of institutional verification and a stack of paperwork thick enough to fill a folder of its own. The cottage sat on 2 acres at the edge of town, close enough to maintain her connections, but far enough to preserve the solitude she had come to value more deeply than she once would have imagined. The restoration work on the cottage had become her anchor. Each evening, after the administrative demands of managing the trust and coordinating with the specialist teams had released their grip on her attention, she changed into work clothes and descended into the practical, physical labor of rebuilding something with her own hands. The cottage had been neglected for years before she purchased it, its previous owners having allowed time and weather to do what indifference always did to stone and timber. The roof leaked in 3 places. The chimney had partially collapsed. Window frames had rotted where moisture had been allowed to pool without drainage. The foundation, though sound in its bones, showed cracks that needed attention before they became failures. She repaired each flaw with the methodical patience her father had modeled throughout her life. She mixed mortar by hand, feeling the grit and calcium between her fingers, adjusting consistency by instinct rather than measurement until the texture matched what her memory told her was correct. She replaced timber where it had failed, selecting wood that matched the original in grain and density, fitting joints with the precision of someone who understood that carelessness in a single connection could compromise an entire structure. She repointed stone walls section by section, working from the foundation upward, ensuring that each course was stable before building upon it. The work was slow. She had no deadline, no contractor pressing for completion, no external expectation beyond her own standards. Some evenings, she completed a single square meter of wall. Other evenings, she spent an hour simply studying a section of stonework, reading its history in the patterns of wear and repair that previous hands had left behind. The cottage spoke to her the way the cellar had spoken, in a language of materials and intentions that required patience to hear and skill to interpret. Neighbors who passed the cottage during her evening work sessions sometimes stopped to watch. The sight of a woman mixing mortar and fitting stone by hand was unusual enough to draw attention, and the knowledge of who she was and what she had found made the image more striking still. A woman worth $326 million, kneeling in the dirt, repairing a wall that a hired crew could have finished in a fraction of the time. The disconnect between wealth and labor confused those who believed that money's primary purpose was the elimination of effort. Eleanor did not explain herself. She did not need to. The work was its own explanation, as clear and self-sufficient as the stone beneath her hands. Martin visited the cottage once during its early restoration, arriving unannounced on a Saturday morning with a box of pastries from the bakery in town and an expression that suggested the visit had been debated internally for some time before being undertaken. He stood in the doorway, surveying the exposed beams and stripped plaster with the practiced eye of someone who had spent the past year overseeing his own renovation. His assessment was delivered in the careful tone he had adopted since the revelation, a tone that replaced confidence with something closer to respect. The cottage had good bones, he said. The foundation was solid. The stone was local, quarried from the same ridge that had supplied material for the Hargrove house. He pointed out details she had already noticed, the way the lintels had been cut to follow the natural grain of the stone, the way the chimney had been positioned to draw prevailing winds through the flue. His observations were technically accurate and emotionally transparent. He was trying to connect with her through the only language they had always shared, the language of buildings and materials, the vocabulary their father had taught both of them in different ways and to different depths. Eleanor accepted the pastries, made coffee in the small kitchen she had already restored a function, and listened to her brother with a generosity that surprised them both. They talked about stone for an hour, about the properties of different mortars, about the challenges of matching new material to old without creating visible seams. They did not talk about the cellar. They did not talk about the will. They did not talk about the months of dismissal and the revelation that had ended them. They talked about stone, and in talking about stone, they found a surface on which both of them could stand without the ground shifting beneath their feet. When Martin left, He paused at the door and said something that Eleanor would remember for years. He said that their father would have liked the cottage. The statement was simple, almost casual, but its weight was considerable. It was the first time since the discovery that Martin had invoked their father without defensiveness, without the need to position himself within the hierarchy of inheritance. He spoke of Richard Hargrove as a man with preferences and tastes, not as a man who had divided an estate. The distinction was subtle but significant. It suggested that Martin was beginning to see their father as Eleanor had always seen him, as a person rather than a source of legitimacy. Eleanor thanked him and watched him drive away. The pastries were good. The conversation had been better. She returned to her wall with a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with mortar and everything to do with the slow, patient work of rebuilding something more important than a cottage. Spring arrived with the urgency it always carried in the region, transforming the hillside from white to green in a matter of weeks. Eleanor's cottage took shape alongside the season, its exterior walls restored to a solidity that would have satisfied her grandfather's standards. She planted a garden along the south-facing wall, choosing herbs and vegetables that her mother had grown in the kitchen garden of the Hargrove house, rosemary and thyme and tomatoes that climbed wooden stakes in the summer heat. The garden was not practical in any meaningful sense. The produce it yielded was modest, supplementing rather than replacing what she purchased in town. But it connected her to a memory she valued, the image of her mother's hands in dark soil, coaxing life from ground that had been worked for generations. The trust continued its quiet growth, managed by the team Rebecca Caldwell had assembled with the same attention to competence and discretion that characterized everything about the discovery's aftermath. Quarterly reports arrived in sealed envelopes, their contents reviewed and filed with the same meticulous care Richard had applied to his own records. The numbers grew steadily, compounding with the patient inevitability that had defined the collection's existence from the beginning. Eleanor reviewed each report thoroughly, understanding the mechanics of wealth management well enough to ask informed questions while trusting the expertise she had hired to handle the specifics. The scholarship fund she had established produced its first recipients that spring, 3 students whose applications had been reviewed by a committee Eleanor had assembled from professionals in preservation, conservation, and heritage management. She met each student individually, not as a benefactor dispensing charity, but as a colleague sharing a discipline. She told them about her father without mentioning the cellar, describing instead his approach to maintenance, his belief that every structure deserved attention proportional to its history, his conviction that the work of preservation was not a luxury, but a responsibility. The students listened with the particular attentiveness of young people who recognize sincerity in an adult, and Eleanor felt, for the first time, the beginning of what her grandfather had intended when he built the chamber. The wealth was not an end. It was a means of transmission, a way of carrying forward not just money but values, not just assets but understanding. The Historical Property Restoration Program funded its first project that same season, a farmhouse on the eastern edge of the county whose owners had been unable to afford the repairs necessary to prevent its collapse. Eleanor visited the site personally, walking the property with the same careful attention she applied to her own work. The farmhouse was older than the Hargrove house by nearly 40 years, its construction reflecting techniques and materials that had largely disappeared from the region. The stone was hand-cut, the timbers joined without nails, the roof framed with a skill that modern builders acknowledged but rarely replicated. Losing it would have meant losing not just a building, but a record, a physical document of how people had lived and built and endured in a time before the systems that now sustain them existed. The restoration took 6 months and employed a team of specialists whose skills matched the building's demands. Eleanor oversaw the project without micromanaging it, providing direction where her expertise was relevant and deferring where it was not. The result was a farmhouse restored to structural integrity without sacrificing the character that made it worth saving. The owners, an elderly couple whose gratitude was expressed more through silence than speech, invited Eleanor to dinner on the evening the final inspection was completed. She accepted, sitting at a table in a kitchen that smelled of fresh plaster and old wood, eating a meal prepared with ingredients from a garden not unlike the one she was growing at her own cottage. The evening was quiet and warm and entirely without pretense, and Eleanor drove home afterward with the conviction that this, more than any number in a quarterly report, was what the fortune had been meant to accomplish. Catherine's relationship with Eleanor evolved through a series of professional collaborations that gradually acquired personal dimensions neither sister had anticipated. The financial restructuring Catherine had undertaken to complement the trust required regular communication, and the communication, initially confined to spreadsheets and strategy documents, began to include conversations that ventured beyond numbers. Catherine asked about the cottage one afternoon during a call that had been scheduled to discuss tax implications, and the question carried a curiosity that was not entirely professional. Eleanor described the restoration in detail, and Catherine listened with an attention that surprised both of them. When the call ended, it had lasted 40 minutes longer than planned, and the tax discussion had been deferred to the following week. A month later, Catherine visited. She arrived in a rental car, dressed in clothing that suggested she had given thought to what one wore when visiting a sister's stone cottage in the country. She walked the property with Eleanor, examining the restored walls, the garden, the view from the kitchen window that looked out across fields toward the ridge where the Hargrove house stood in the distance. She said little, but her silence was different from the efficient quiet she had maintained during the months of the estate division. This silence carried weight, the weight of a woman reassessing not just her sister, but the framework through which she had viewed the world. Over dinner, prepared by Eleanor in the cottage kitchen using herbs from the garden, Catherine said something that shifted the air between them. She said that she had been wrong about the cellar, and about Eleanor, and about their father. The admission was delivered without the emotional drama that might have accompanied it from someone less disciplined. Catherine stated it as a fact, the way she stated financial projections or market assessments, with the cool precision of a mind that had analyzed the data and arrived at an inescapable conclusion. She had been wrong. The evidence was overwhelming. She accepted it. But then she added something that Eleanor had not anticipated. She said that her mistake had not been limited to the cellar. She said that for years, she had measured her sister's worth by the same metrics she applied to investments, productivity, visibility, return on effort. By those metrics, Eleanor had always appeared to be underperforming, a talented woman who chose modest work over ambitious enterprise, who stayed close to home when opportunity lay elsewhere, who valued craft over strategy. Catherine admitted that she had confused quietness with weakness, and that the discovery had forced her to reconsider not only her assessment of Eleanor, but the framework that had produced it. A system that could not recognize $326 million hidden in plain sight was a system with a fundamental flaw. Catherine was not accustomed to fundamental flaws in her own thinking, and the adjustment was, she conceded, still in progress. Eleanor received the admission the way she had received Martin's, with grace and without the need for elaboration. She poured more wine, passed the bread, and changed the subject to a documentary Catherine had mentioned wanting to see. The evening continued in a tone that neither sister had experienced since childhood, comfortable, unguarded, and free of the calculations that had governed their interactions for years. When Catherine left the following morning, she embraced Eleanor at the door with a firmness that communicated what words would have diminished. The embrace lasted several seconds longer than either of them expected, and when they separated, Catherine's eyes carried a brightness that had nothing to do with the morning light. The community archive Eleanor had funded opened to the public on a Tuesday in early autumn, precisely 1 year after the discovery. The timing was coincidental, but Eleanor noted it with the quiet appreciation of someone who had learned to read significance in patterns. The archive occupied a renovated space in the old municipal building, its shelves and display cases holding documents, photographs, and artifacts that traced the region's history from its earliest settlements to the present day. Eleanor had contributed materials from the Hargrove family's own records, documents from the cellar above that held historical rather than financial value, letters and photographs, and land records that illuminated not just her family's story, but the community's. The opening was attended by more people than the space comfortably held, a testament to the interest the discovery had generated and the goodwill the archive represented. Eleanor moved through the crowd with the composed ease of a woman who had learned that wealth, properly managed, could rebuild relationships as effectively as it could strain them. She spoke with neighbors who had once whispered about her, with relatives who had revised their assessments, with strangers who knew her story only through its retelling. Each conversation was brief, warm, and free of the tension that had characterized her interactions with the community for so long. Martin attended with his wife and their 2 children, a boy of 11 and a girl of 8. The children moved through the archive with the undisciplined curiosity of young people encountering history for the first time, pulling open drawers, pointing at photographs, asking questions that their parents answered with varying degrees of accuracy. Eleanor watched them from across the room and felt something shift in her understanding of the inheritance's purpose. These children, her niece and nephew, were the next generation. The wealth in the chamber would eventually touch their lives, shape their opportunities, define the choices available to them. The trust she had established would ensure that the fortune endured, but the archive, the scholarships, the restoration program, these were the mechanisms through which the fortune's meaning would be transmitted. Martin's daughter, the 8-year-old whose curiosity outpaced her caution, found a photograph of the Hargrove house taken during its construction in 1933. The image showed the foundation exposed, its walls rising from a trench cut deep into the hillside, the surrounding landscape stripped of vegetation and reshaped by machinery that appeared primitive by modern standards. The girl brought the photograph to Eleanor, holding it with both hands, and asked whether this was the same house where her father lived. Eleanor confirmed that it was. The girl studied the image for a long moment and then asked a question that made Eleanor's breath catch. She asked what was underneath. Eleanor looked at her niece, at the openness in her face and the uncalculated curiosity in her eyes, and felt the future lean closer. She knelt beside the girl and pointed to the foundation in the photograph, explaining that every building had layers, that what was visible above ground was supported by what existed below, and that the strongest structures were built by people who cared as much about what could not be seen as what could. The girl listened with the serious attention of a child processing information she did not fully understand, but sensed was important. When Eleanor finished, the girl nodded once, returned the photograph to its drawer, and moved on to the next display with the effortless momentum of youth. Eleanor remained where she was for a moment, watching her niece disappear around a corner, and understood that the conversation they had just shared was itself a form of inheritance. Not money, not property, not legal language defining ownership and obligation. Something simpler and more durable. A way of seeing, a habit of looking beneath surfaces, a willingness to believe that the most important things were often the ones no one thought to mention. She thought about her grandfather, standing in the unfinished chamber in 1934, pressing his initials into wet concrete. He had been thinking about the future, not his own future, which was already secure, but the future of people he would never meet, descendants whose names he could not know, whose lives would unfold in a world he could not imagine. The chamber had been his answer to the uncertainty of that future, a reserve of value placed beyond the reach of the forces that destroyed wealth in the world above. And now, nearly a century later, that reserve was being converted into something he might not have predicted, but would certainly have understood. Not gold held in darkness, but opportunity released into the light. The archive's opening concluded with a brief ceremony in which the mayor acknowledged the Hargrove family's contribution to the community's historical record. The speech was carefully worded, referencing the discovery without dwelling on its financial dimensions, emphasizing instead the cultural significance of preserving a region's memory for future generations. Eleanor stood quietly at the back of the room during the speech, her hands folded, her expression carrying the composed stillness that had become her signature in public settings. When the applause ended, she slipped out through the side door and walked to her car in the parking lot, breathing the autumn air that carried the first suggestion of winter. She drove to the cottage and parked in the gravel driveway she had laid herself the previous month, each stone selected and placed with attention to drainage and load distribution. The cottage was warm inside, its restored chimney drawing perfectly, its walls holding heat the way old stone was meant to do. The fire she had set before leaving that morning had burned down to embers, and she added 2 logs from the stack she had split herself, watching the flames catch and grow with the quiet satisfaction of a person who had learned that the simplest comforts were often the most sustaining. She made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the notebook she had begun keeping since the discovery, a record of decisions made, lessons learned, and observations about the slow process of becoming the person her inheritance required her to be. She wrote about the archive opening, about the children pulling open drawers, about Martin's presence and Catherine's earlier visit. She wrote about the farmhouse restoration and the students who would carry preservation into the next generation. She wrote about the cottage itself, about the satisfaction of work done by hand, about the connection between repairing a wall and repairing a life. The words came easily, flowing with a directness that her father would have recognized and her grandfather would have approved. No embellishment, no sentiment beyond what the facts supported. Just a clear, careful record of a woman learning to hold something extraordinary without being consumed by it. Near the bottom of the page, she wrote a line that she would return to many times in the years that followed. She wrote that the hardest part of inheriting a fortune was not the discovery or the authentication or the management. The hardest part was understanding that the fortune had always been there, beneath the surface, waiting for someone patient enough to find it, and that the patience itself was not a trait she had developed, but a gift she had been given, shaped by a father whose silence had been the loudest form of love she had ever known. She closed the notebook, finished her tea, and stepped outside into the evening air. The stars were beginning to appear above the ridge, the same stars that had watched over the Hargrove house for 90 years, the same stars that had shone down on the chamber's construction and on every quiet descent her father had made into its silence. She stood in her garden, surrounded by the herbs her mother had grown and the stone her father had taught her to read, and she felt the full weight of her inheritance settle into a balance that no longer pressed but simply held. The fortune beneath the cellar would continue to grow. The trust would continue to distribute its returns into projects that carried the family's values forward. The community would continue to adjust, to absorb, to integrate the discovery into its own story of who it was and what it valued. And Eleanor would continue to do what she had always done. She would kneel on cold stone and listen what it told her. She would mix mortar and fit joints and read the language of old wood and ancient foundations. She would care for things that other people overlooked, protect things that other people dismissed, and find value in places where no one else thought to look. It was what her father had taught her. It was what the cellar had confirmed. And it was, she understood now, with a certainty that reached deeper than any chamber, the truest measure of who she had always been. The cottage settled around her as the evening deepened, its walls holding their warmth, its stone remembering the hands that had shaped it. Inside the kitchen, the notebook lay closed on the table, its pages carrying the weight of a story that had begun with a letter in a will and had become something larger than any document could contain. The story was not finished. Stories built on foundations this deep never truly finished. They continued, passing from one generation to the next, carried not by words alone, but by the choices people made when no one was watching, by the patience they practiced when no one understood, and by the quiet, unshakable conviction that some things were worth protecting even when the rest of the world looked the other way. Eleanor Hargrove had been given a cellar. The world had called it nothing. Her family had called it a disappointment. The community had called it proof that even loving fathers sometimes made mistakes with their final wishes. But beneath that cellar, beneath the flagstone floor and the precisely engineered mechanism and the stairs that descended into perfect silence, $326 million had waited with the patience of stone for the one person who would not walk away for what others dismissed. The one person who would kneel on cold ground and read the language written there. The one person who understood that the most valuable things in this world are not always the ones you can see, but the ones that someone you love trusted you enough to find. Some fortunes are built to be displayed. Others are built to endure. Richard Hargrove had understood the difference, and in the end, so did the daughter he trusted to carry it forward. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story.